There is a particular quality to life before a great rupture. A texture of the ordinary that people rarely notice until it is gone. The smell of bread baking in a colonial hearth, the creak of a wooden shop sign swinging in harbor wind, the murmur of a congregation settling into pews on a Sunday morning in a town where everyone knows their neighbor's name. This is where we must begin, not in the thunder of cannon or the urgency of pamphlets, but in the long, settled quiet of a world that had not yet learned it was about to end. In the first half of the 18th century, the American colonies were, by almost any measure, a functioning and largely contented part of the British Empire. They were not paradise. They were not without their tensions or their cruelties or their contradictions. But they were home to perhaps 1.5 million people by mid-century, and for most of those people, the rhythms of daily life were shaped not by thoughts of independence or revolution but by the immediate demands of farm and family, trade and faith. The colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard from the rocky shores of Massachusetts in the north to the warm, marshy lowlands of Georgia in the south, and each region carried its own character, its own economy, its own social texture. In New England, the landscape was shaped by fishing and timber and small manufacturing, by tight-knit towns gathered around a meeting house, by a religious inheritance that placed particular weight on the idea of community covenant and moral accountability. Life there was close and scrutinizing in the way that small towns always are. Neighbors watched one another carefully, not out of malice in most cases, but because in communities where survival depended on collective effort, the behavior of any one person mattered to everyone else. Further south, in the middle colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, the world was more diverse and more commercially oriented. Philadelphia, by the mid-18th century, was arguably the most cosmopolitan city in British North America, a place where Quakers and Presbyterians and Anglicans and German-speaking immigrants and merchants of a dozen origins moved through the same streets, transacted business at the same counting houses, and occasionally sat in the same coffee houses debating the questions of the day. New York was a trading city with a strong Dutch heritage still visible in its architecture and some of its family names, a place that looked outward toward the Atlantic with a merchant's eye. And in the southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, the economy was built on tobacco and rice and indigo, and increasingly on the labor of enslaved Africans whose presence constituted one of the deepest moral contradictions of this entire era. The great planters of Virginia and South Carolina occupied a world of considerable wealth and elaborate social hierarchy, a world in which gentry families like the Washingtons and the Lees and the Randolphs thought of themselves very consciously as English gentlemen, educated in English traditions, reading English books, corresponding with English merchants, and participating as fully as the distance of an ocean allowed in the cultural life of the mother country. That distance was real and it mattered. The Atlantic crossing took weeks, sometimes months, depending on the season and the winds. News traveled slowly. Orders from London arrived slowly. The colonies had, partly out of necessity and partly out of the particular circumstances of their founding, developed a significant degree of local self-governance. Each colony had its own elected assembly, its own system of courts, its own local traditions of law and taxation. These assemblies were not democratic in any modern sense. Voting rights were generally restricted to men of property, and the institution of slavery meant that a large portion of the population had no political standing at all. But within those limits, the colonial assemblies had accumulated real power over the decades. They raised taxes, they appropriated funds, they passed local legislation, and they did so with a degree of independence that, in retrospect, would prove to be one of the central sources of the coming conflict. The colonists themselves, however, did not generally experience this local autonomy as a source of tension with Britain. Quite the opposite. Most of them believed, sincerely and without particular irony, that their local assemblies were simply the colonial expression of the great tradition of English liberty, the same tradition of representative governance that had produced the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the constitutional settlement that placed Parliament at the center of English political life. When a Virginia planter cited his rights as an Englishman, he was not claiming something exotic or radical. He was reaching for a birthright that he genuinely believed was his by inheritance, passed down through centuries of English constitutional development. This sense of identity as British subjects was not merely legal or abstract. It was cultural and emotional. Colonial churches used the Book of Common Prayer. Colonial schoolchildren read English literature and studied English history. The portraits that hung in the parlors of prosperous colonial homes depicted men and women in the fashions of London. The wealthier families sent their sons to England for education, and some of those young men came back with English accents they had carefully cultivated and English friends they would correspond with for the rest of their lives. When colonists spoke of home, some of them meant the colony where they had been born, but others still meant England, a place many of them had never seen but toward which they felt an inherited loyalty that was entirely genuine. The economic relationship between the colonies and Britain was defined, officially and legally, by a body of legislation known broadly as the Navigation Acts, which had been accumulating since the middle of the 17th century. The principle behind these laws was the mercantile theory that dominated economic thinking in Britain and across Europe in this period, the idea that colonies existed to serve the economic interests of the mother country, providing raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, and that trade should be channeled to maximize the wealth and power of the empire as a whole, meaning in practice the wealth and power of Britain. Colonial tobacco had to be shipped to British ports. Colonial trade was largely required to pass through British merchants. Colonial manufacturing was discouraged where it might compete with British industry. In theory, this system was restrictive. In practice, it was administered with a looseness that historians have sometimes described as salutary neglect, a phrase associated with the British politician Robert Walpole, who dominated British politics in the earlier part of the 18th century. Walpole and those who thought like him believed that the colonies were most profitably governed not through rigorous enforcement of every regulation, but through a kind of benign inattention that allowed colonial commerce to flourish and colonial loyalty to remain comfortable and unchallenged. Customs officials in colonial ports were often susceptible to bribery, or simply overwhelmed by the volume of trade. Smuggling was widespread and largely tolerated. The theoretical restrictions of the Navigation Acts and the practical reality of colonial commerce were significantly different things. The result was that many colonists, merchants, planters, farmers with goods to sell, had developed economic habits and expectations that were not entirely consistent with what the law on paper required of them. They traded where trade was profitable. They found ways around regulations that were inconvenient. They did not think of this as disloyalty. They thought of it as ordinary commerce. And for a long time Britain asked few questions. Underneath all of this lay a larger imperial system that was, by the middle of the 18th century, under considerable strain. The British Empire was vast. It stretched across the Caribbean into India, along the coasts of West Africa, and across the North American continent in ways that were still being defined. Administering this empire was expensive. Defending it was more expensive still. In the mid-18th century, Europe and its colonial extensions were completely convulsed by war during this period. Wars over territory, over succession, over the balance of power on a continent that seemed constitutionally incapable of settling into stability. The war that would change everything for Britain, for the colonies, and for the entire Atlantic world, began in a relatively obscure dispute over land in the Ohio Valley. In the early 1750s, both Britain and France had competing claims to the vast interior of the North American continent, and Virginia in particular had commercial and speculative interests in the land west of the Allegheny Mountains. A young Virginia militia officer named George Washington, barely in his 20s, was dispatched to the frontier with a small force, and the skirmishes that resulted from that mission helped ignite what would become, in its European dimensions, the 7 Years' War, a conflict that eventually drew in nearly every major European power and was fought across multiple continents, in the forests of North America, on the plains of Europe, in the waters of the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean. In North America, the conflict was called the French and Indian War by the colonists, a name that reflected the alliance between France and many of the indigenous nations who had their own reasons for resisting British expansion. The war was brutal and prolonged, lasting from approximately 1754 to 1763, and it transformed the map of North America completely. By its conclusion, Britain had expelled France from Canada and from most of its North American holdings east of the Mississippi. It was an enormous military victory, and it left Britain in an apparently commanding position on the continent. But victory had come at a staggering cost. Britain had gone deeply into debt to finance the war, a debt that, by 1763, stood at something in the range of £130 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era. The annual interest payments alone threatened to destabilize British public finances. At the same time, the newly expanded empire required military forces to defend it. The French had been expelled, but the interior of North America was not empty or pacified. The uprising led by the Ottawa leader Pontiac in 1763, in which a confederation of indigenous nations attacked British forts and settlements across the Great Lakes region, demonstrated vividly that the frontier required a permanent military presence. And maintaining that presence was going to cost money that Britain did not have. The solution, to British ministers and members of Parliament in London, seemed perfectly obvious and entirely reasonable. The colonies had benefited enormously from the war. They had been protected by British arms. Their western boundaries had been secured. The threat of French encirclement from Canada had been removed. It was only fair, or so the argument ran in London, that the colonies should contribute to the cost of their own defense. And so, beginning in the early 1760s, the British government made a series of decisions that would, in combination, prove catastrophic to the imperial relationship. The first significant change came with the Proclamation of 1763, which drew a line along the Allegheny Mountains and prohibited colonial settlement west of that boundary. The stated purpose was to stabilize relations with indigenous nations and reduce the cost of frontier conflicts. But for the many colonists, particularly in Virginia and Pennsylvania, who had speculative investments in Western land, or who saw the West as the future of colonial expansion, the proclamation felt like a betrayal. They had just fought a war that was supposed to open the West to British settlement, and now the Crown was telling them they could not go there. More consequential still was the decision to generate colonial revenue through taxation. The British government under the young Prime Minister George Grenville turned its attention to the American colonies with an intention to reform and tighten what had become a notoriously lax system of imperial administration. The first major initiative was the Revenue Act of 1764, often called the Sugar Act, which modified and in some cases lowered the existing duties on imported molasses but simultaneously increased enforcement mechanisms, and made clear that the purpose was actually to collect revenue rather than simply to regulate trade. For New England merchants in particular, whose rum industry depended on access to Caribbean molasses, this was a practical commercial concern. But the broader implication, that Parliament intended to tax the colonies for revenue, was the more alarming signal. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765. It is difficult to overstate how significant this single piece of legislation was in the developing history of colonial discontent. The Stamp Act required that a tax stamp be purchased and affixed to a wide range of printed materials within the colonies: newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, playing cards, almanacs, and many other items. This was not a tax on trade. It was a direct tax levied on the internal commercial and civic life of the colonies, collected by officials within the colonies themselves. And it was passed by a parliament in which no colonist sat and no colonist voted. The distinction between external taxes, duties on trade, and internal taxes, direct levies on colonial activity, was one that colonial thinkers had been developing and refining for some years. It rested on a deeper principle that had become central to colonial political thought: the idea that taxation required representation. This was not, as colonists were careful to emphasize, a novel or revolutionary idea. It was, they insisted, a fundamental principle of English constitutional law, rooted in centuries of parliamentary development. The same tradition that had produced the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights of 1689 held that a freeborn Englishman could not be taxed without his consent, expressed through his representatives. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament. Therefore, Parliament had no right to tax them directly. The British response to this argument was dismissive rather than sympathetic. Parliament, the official position held, represented all British subjects everywhere, a doctrine known as virtual representation. Colonists in Massachusetts or Virginia were no different in this regard from the many people in Britain itself who lived in districts that sent no member to Parliament. The idea that only actual elected representatives could authorize taxation was, from the British parliamentary perspective, simply wrong as a matter of constitutional theory. This disagreement went deeper than a dispute about particular taxes. It reflected genuinely different understandings of what the British Constitution was and how it worked. For British parliamentarians, parliamentary sovereignty was the bedrock principle. Parliament was supreme, and its authority admitted no exceptions. For colonists steeped in their own traditions of local self-governance, the relationship between Parliament and the colonial assemblies was something more like a division of jurisdictions, with Parliament handling imperial matters and local assemblies handling local affairs, including local taxation. These two understandings could not both be right. And neither side at this stage was willing to concede the point. The colonial reaction to the Stamp Act was swift, passionate, and organized in ways that surprised many observers on both sides of the Atlantic. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry introduced a set of resolutions asserting that Virginians had the right to be taxed only by their own assembly. His speech on the occasion was reportedly electrifying, a performance of such rhetorical intensity that it reportedly moved some observers to cry out that his words bordered on treason, though the precise details of what was said have been embellished and disputed in various accounts over the years. What is clear is that the Virginia Resolves, as they came to be known, were widely reprinted throughout the colonies and helped set the terms of the public debate. That same summer of 1765 saw the formation of a network of political associations that would prove far more durable and consequential than any single legislative resolution. In Boston, a group of activists organized themselves under the name the Sons of Liberty, a phrase reportedly taken from a speech by the British politician Isaac Barr, who had used the term in Parliament while arguing against the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty were not a unified organization with a single membership list and a formal structure. They were more of a loosely affiliated movement, existing in various colonial cities and towns, connecting merchants and artisans and lawyers and printers in a common purpose of resistance. Their methods were not always peaceful. In August of 1765, a mob in Boston destroyed the home of the stamp distributor Andrew Oliver, who subsequently resigned his commission before the act even went into effect. Later that month, the house of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson was ransacked by another crowd. His library and papers scattered, his belongings destroyed. These acts of violence troubled many colonial leaders, including some who were themselves strongly opposed to the Stamp Act. The line between principled political resistance and mob destruction was one that thoughtful colonists were acutely aware of, and the more prominent voices in the resistance movement were generally at pains to draw that line clearly, even when events on the ground made it harder to hold. But alongside the violence was something more organized and ultimately more effective: the economic boycott. Colonial merchants in city after city agreed to refuse to import British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. This was a strategy with real teeth, because the colonial market was genuinely significant to British manufacturers and merchants. When British exporters saw their American orders dry up and their colonial debtors refused to pay on the grounds that legal commerce was impossible without stamps, the pressure on Parliament was direct and commercial in the most immediate sense. In October of 1765, delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress, the first significant intercolonial political gathering in American history. The delegates drafted a series of declarations asserting the rights of colonists as British subjects, including the right not to be taxed without their consent. They were careful to frame their claims in the language of British constitutional tradition rather than the language of independence. They were loyal subjects asserting their rights, not rebels challenging the authority of the crown. But the act of meeting together, of coordinating a common response across colonial boundaries, was itself significant. It suggested that the colonies, usually so divided by geography and interest in regional culture, could find common cause when the provocation was sufficient. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March of 1766, and the relief in the colonies was genuine and widespread. Bells rang. Toasts were drunk. Public celebrations gave voice to what seemed like a restoration of the proper relationship between Britain and its American subjects. But Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted flatly that Parliament had the authority to legislate for the colonies in all matters whatsoever. From the British perspective, the repeal of the Stamp Act was a pragmatic concession to commercial pressure, not a recognition that the colonial constitutional argument had any merit. From the colonial perspective, the Declaratory Act was largely ignored in the general relief over repeal, filed away as a statement of abstract principle that no one expected to be acted upon. That expectation proved wrong. A new British government under Charles Townshend, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, revisited the question of colonial taxation with what he believed was a more sophisticated approach. If the colonists objected to internal taxes but not to external duties on trade, then external duties it would be. Beginning in 1767, the Townshend Acts imposed duties on a range of imported goods including glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. The revenue was to be used not only for colonial defense but also to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, removing those officials from dependence on colonial assemblies for their compensation and thus, in the British view, making them more impartial and more effective instruments of imperial governance. This last provision was, from the colonial perspective, particularly alarming. The power of colonial assemblies to control the salaries of royal officials had been one of the most effective tools of local political leverage. If governors and judges were paid from London, they were answerable to London. The meaning was clear enough. This was not just about trade duties. This was about control. The colonial reaction drew on the same repertoire as the response to the Stamp Act, but the movement was now more experienced and more organized. John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania lawyer and landowner of considerable prominence, published a series of essays known as the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which circulated widely throughout the colonies and made the constitutional case against the Townshend Acts in careful, moderate, lawyerly prose. Dickinson's argument was that external duties levied for the purpose of raising revenue, rather than regulating trade, were constitutionally no different from internal taxes. Both required the consent of colonial representatives, and neither could be legitimately imposed by Parliament alone. His letters were read and discussed in taverns and coffeehouses from New Hampshire to Georgia, and they helped frame a colonial consensus that was becoming more clearly articulated with each successive controversy. The boycott movement revived and spread. Colonial women, whose role in domestic consumption was central to the effectiveness of any non-importation agreement, organized in support of the effort with a visibility and purposefulness that was notable. Groups sometimes called Daughters of Liberty gathered to spin cloth locally rather than purchase imported British fabric, transforming a domestic activity into a political statement. The decision to drink local herbal teas rather than the imported variety from Britain's East India Company became a small daily act of political commitment that anyone, regardless of wealth or education or legal standing, could perform. The politics of consumption had become the politics of resistance. The Sons of Liberty continued their activities, with Boston remaining the most turbulent and politically charged of the colonial cities. Several factors made Boston a particular center of unrest. It was a port city whose merchant class had a direct economic stake in the question of trade regulation and taxation. It was a city with a long tradition of engaged popular politics, in which a broader spectrum of the male population participated in public life than was typical in more hierarchical communities to the south. It had newspapers, and Boston was notable for its printing trade, that gave voice to dissident opinion with a sharpness and regularity that alarmed royal officials. And it had men like Samuel Adams, who was arguably the most effective political organizer in colonial America. Adams is a figure about whom historians have disagreed considerably, and the disagreements are instructive. To his admirers, he was the indispensable radical, the man who kept the flame of resistance burning when others were tempted by accommodation, the architect of a popular political movement whose genius lay in its ability to mobilize ordinary people around ideas that had previously been the province of educated elites. To his critics, including many contemporaries, he was a demagogue and a manipulator, a man of limited personal financial success who found in political agitation both a vocation and a compensation for other disappointments, someone who deliberately inflamed popular passions that he could not always control and did not always try to. The truth, as is usually the case with complex historical figures, was probably somewhere in between these portraits, though the balance will be argued as long as historians have archives to consult. What is not in dispute is that Adams was extraordinarily effective. He understood intuitively that political ideas required organizational infrastructure to become political movements, and he worked tirelessly to create that infrastructure, through committees, through correspondence networks, through the pages of newspapers to which he contributed under a variety of pseudonyms, through the cultivation of alliances among men of different social stations, who might not otherwise have found themselves working toward common goals. His cousin John Adams, a lawyer of formidable intellect and often difficult temperament, moved in somewhat different circles but shared Samuel's fundamental conviction that the colonial constitutional position was sound and had to be defended. The Townshend Acts also brought to Boston something that would prove more inflammatory than any tax. Soldiers. As tension mounted in the city, the British government decided that a show of military force was necessary to back up the authority of royal officials, who were finding it increasingly difficult to do their jobs in the face of organized popular resistance. In the autumn of 1768, approximately 4,000 British troops arrived in Boston, a city of perhaps 16,000 inhabitants. The ratio of soldiers to civilians was striking and, to many Bostonians, deeply offensive. The quartering of soldiers in civilian communities was already a grievance in the colonies. The Quartering Act of 1765 had required colonial authorities to provide accommodation and supplies for British troops, an obligation that many colonies had resisted or evaded. The actual arrival of soldiers in Boston's streets and taverns and marketplaces brought the abstract grievance into daily, physical reality. Soldiers were competitors for employment in a city where working men were already struggling economically. They were symbols of a power that Bostonians increasingly experienced as alien and oppressive, rather than protective and paternal. They were young men far from home, often poorly paid and inadequately supervised, who brought with them the tensions and occasional violence that military occupation always introduces into civilian communities. The relationship between Boston's civilian population and the soldiers quartered among them was, by most accounts, one of sustained mutual hostility, punctuated by incidents of friction and occasional violence in both directions. Soldiers were jeered in the streets. Off-duty soldiers seeking additional employment in the docks and rope walks came into conflict with workers who resented the competition. There were fights, arrests, trials, accusations. The Boston press, led by papers sympathetic to the resistance movement, documented every incident in detail and framed each one as evidence of the inherent danger of standing armies in a free society, a danger that English political tradition had long recognized, and that the presence of these particular soldiers seemed to combat. Meanwhile, colonial resistance was achieving some of its immediate goals. The non-importation movement was hurting Virginia. British merchants were lacking Parliament for relief. In 1770, a new British government under Lord North decided to repeal most of the Townshend duties, not as a concession that they were unconstitutional, but as a practical matter of economic sense. Almost all of them were removed. The exception was the duty on tea, which Lord North retained specifically as an assertion of principle, a demonstration that Parliament had not abandoned its claim to the right to tax the colonies. That single remaining duty would become, in time, enormously significant. But before the tea duty had played out its full consequences, something happened in Boston that crystallized the tensions of the preceding years into an image so powerful and so contested that it would shape the way both sides understood the conflict for years afterward. The winter of 1769 to 1770 had been tense. The interactions between soldiers and civilians had continued their pattern of hostility and minor violence. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a sequence of events unfolded on King Street in Boston that ended with 5 colonists dead and several more wounded, shot by soldiers of the 29th Regiment. The precise details of what happened are, and have always been, disputed. This is not merely a matter of historical uncertainty. The disputed nature of the event was immediately recognized and immediately exploited by both sides. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. There was a confrontation that evening between a crowd of civilians and a small group of soldiers. The crowd was agitated and threatening in ways that witnesses described in various terms, from frightening mob violence to justifiable public protest. The soldiers were frightened and arguably provoked. Shots were fired, though whether under orders, spontaneously in panic, or in response to commands from within the crowd is something that witnesses contradicted one another about from the very beginning. 5 men died. Among them were Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American ancestry whose presence in the crowd has made him a figure of particular significance in subsequent historical memory, and Samuel Gray and James Caldwell and Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr. The event was immediately named a massacre by those determined to present it as evidence of British tyranny. Paul Revere, the Boston silversmith and engraver who was also deeply embedded in the resistance networks of the city, produced and distributed a vivid engraving depicting a disciplined line of soldiers firing into a defenseless crowd at the command of an officer, with the caption identifying it as the Bloody Massacre. The image was compelling and effective as propaganda. It was also, as historians have noted, significantly misleading in several respects. The scene it depicted bore only a partial relationship to what witnesses of varying reliability described as having actually occurred. The royal governor of Massachusetts acted quickly to defuse the immediate crisis, ordering the troops withdrawn from the town of Boston to the Harbor Islands, a concession to popular fury that probably prevented further violence. And in a move that demonstrated the complexity of even the most politically charged moments, John Adams, Samuel Adams's cousin, and one of the most prominent advocates of colonial rights, agreed to serve as defense counsel for the soldiers accused of murder. Adams's reasons were partly principled. He believed that every accused person deserved a legal defense, and that the rule of law was more important than the convenience of the political moment, and partly strategic, in that a fair trial and an acquittal would demonstrate that colonial justice was not mob justice. His decision was not universally applauded among those who shared his political views. But he took the case, and most of the soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder and were branded on their thumbs, a punishment of studied mildness in the circumstances. The acquittals, legally sound as they were by most historical assessments, did nothing to quiet the political uses to which the event was put. In the hands of Samuel Adams and others, the events of March 5, 1770, became not a complicated tragedy of mutual provocation and uncertain command, but a deliberate slaughter of innocent civilians by agents of a tyrannical power. The date was commemorated annually in Boston with public orations designed to keep the memory of the deaths, and the meaning assigned to them, vivid and present. The yearly Massacre Day orations became significant political events in themselves, occasions for rehearsing and reinforcing the narrative that positioned colonists as the victims of arbitrary military power. This is one of the places where the history of the early American Revolution becomes genuinely difficult to hold in clear focus, because it requires acknowledging simultaneously that the event was real, that 5 people died, that those deaths were the direct consequence of the deployment of soldiers in a civilian community already seething with resentment, and that the way the event was represented and remembered was heavily shaped by the political purposes of those doing the representing and remembering. Both things are true. The propaganda was built on a real foundation of violence and death. The violence and death were placed within a narrative framework that served particular political ends, and that simplified and distorted a genuinely complicated event. This is not unusual in history, but it is worth holding both truths at once, because the tension between them tells us something important about how political movements are built, and how historical events become myths. In the years that followed 1770, there was a strange and uneasy interlude. The repeal of most of the Townshend duties had removed the immediate economic provocation. The removal of troops from Boston streets had reduced the daily friction. The boycotts, which had been fraying as colonial merchants found abstention from British goods increasingly expensive and difficult to sustain, largely collapsed. On the surface, something resembling the old relationship seemed to reassert itself. Trade resumed. Correspondence between colonial merchants and their British counterparts returned to something like its former character. There were those on both sides who hoped that the crisis had passed, and that the empire could recover its equilibrium. But underneath the surface, things had changed in ways that could not easily be undone. The political networks that the resistance had built, the correspondence committees, the Sons of Liberty, the connections between printers and lawyers and merchants and artisans in cities from Boston to Charleston, remained in place, waiting. The ideas that the resistance had developed and articulated about representation and taxation, about the constitutional relationship between Parliament and colonial assemblies, about the dangers of standing armies and the rights of British subjects, had spread and taken root in a way that no single reversal of policy could extinguish. And the underlying question, the one that neither the Stamp Act crisis nor the Townshend Acts crisis had actually resolved, remained entirely open. Did Parliament have the right to tax the colonies? Did it have the right to legislate for them in all matters whatsoever, as the Declaratory Act asserted? Or were the colonial assemblies the legitimate vehicles of self-governance for their respective populations, with Parliament's authority limited to matters of genuine concern? These are not questions that could be addressed indefinitely by or tax rates. They were questions about the fundamental structure of the empire. And sooner or later, the answer that either side had yet been addressed. The colonial population itself was not uniform in its responses to these developments. It is one of the persistent simplifications of later historical memory to imagine that the colonists were united in their opposition to British policy, moving together in a coherent and purposeful direction toward independence. The reality was considerably more complicated, and understanding that complexity requires attending to the divisions and disagreements within colonial society as carefully as to its moments of apparent unity. There were colonists, a significant number, though historians debate their proportion and their social distribution, who remained genuinely loyal to the crown and genuinely opposed to the resistance movement. These were people who for various reasons found the colonial protest dangerous, excessive, or fundamentally misguided. Some were royal officials whose positions and livelihoods depended on the functioning of the imperial system. Some were Anglican clergy for whom the Church of England was a spiritual home and British authority a natural support. Some were wealthy merchants or landowners whose economic interests were closely tied to the British connection, and who feared that political disruption would threaten their prosperity. Some were recent immigrants from Britain, who had not yet developed the deeper colonial roots that inclined others toward a more local identity. And some were thoughtful people who simply disagreed with the constitutional arguments being made by the resistance leadership, who believed that parliamentary sovereignty was a real and legitimate principle, and that the colonial position, however eloquently stated, was legally and constitutionally wrong. These loyalists, as they came to be called, were not a monolithic group any more than the patriots were. They disagreed among themselves about the best strategy for maintaining the imperial connection, about how much reform of British policy was desirable, and how much colonial autonomy was acceptable. But they shared a fundamental commitment to the idea that the British Empire was worth preserving and that independence from Britain, which they increasingly saw as the logical destination of the resistance movement, even when its leaders disclaimed any such intention, would be a catastrophe for everyone concerned. Between the committed patriots and the committed loyalists was a broad middle ground of colonists who were ambivalent, uncertain, and pulled in different directions by conflicting loyalties and interests. These were people who might resent a particular tax without drawing from that resentment the sweeping constitutional conclusions that the resistance leadership was drawing. They might admire the courage of the Stamp Act protesters without approving of the destruction of Thomas Hutchinson's home. They might believe that Parliament had exceeded its authority in some respects without believing that the proper response was organized resistance and commercial boycott. This middle ground was crucial and contested, and both the resistance movement and its opponents spent considerable energy trying to occupy it and shape it. Social class complicated everything. The resistance movement in Boston drew significant support from artisans and mechanics and dockworkers, the laboring men of a seaport city who had their own reasons to resent the economic dislocations that British policy was causing, and who were susceptible to mobilization by political leaders skilled in the language of popular grievance. But the resistance leadership also included men of substantial wealth and social standing, merchants like John Hancock, lawyers like John Adams, planters like George Washington in Virginia, who sometimes found the enthusiasm of their more volatile allies uncomfortable and difficult to control. The Sons of Liberty needed the energy of the crowd. They also needed to be careful that the crowd did not discredit the movement by violence that could be used to delegitimize the constitutional arguments at the heart of the cause. In the southern colonies, the resistance had a different character and a different social logic from what it had in New England. The great planters of Virginia and South Carolina were not natural firebrands. They were men of property and order who generally distrusted popular mobilization, and who had their own elaborate systems of social control, including, most fundamentally, the system of racial slavery that undergirded their entire economy. Their resistance to British authority grew not primarily from the experience of trade disruption or from exposure to the political culture of a seaport city, but from a deep sense of affronted gentility, a feeling that their dignity and autonomy as English gentlemen were being violated by a parliament that treated them as subjects to be managed rather than as equals to be consulted. There was also, for some of these southern planters, a more practical and personal dimension to the conflict with Britain. Many of them were significantly indebted to British merchants and London creditors, debts accumulated through decades of tobacco cultivation in a commodity market that frequently worked against the producer, debts that the planter class managed through an elaborate system of extended credit that kept them perpetually financially vulnerable. The possibility that a restructuring of the imperial relationship might relieve some of that debt burden, or at least complicate its collection, was not entirely absent from the political calculations of some who joined the resistance. This is not to say that the Virginia planters were insincere in their constitutional principles. Many of them were clearly and genuinely committed to those principles at real personal cost. But human motivations are rarely entirely pure, and the economic dimension of the colonial crisis is part of its full complexity. The intellectual dimension of the resistance deserves particular attention, because one of the most striking features of this era is the sophistication and the intensity of the political ideas that circulated through it. The colonists were not simply reacting to particular provocations with ad hoc arguments. They were drawing on a rich tradition of political thought, English, classical, and increasingly their own, to construct a coherent critique of what they saw as the corruption and tyranny of the contemporary British political system. The tradition they drew on most heavily was what historians have called the country or republican tradition in English political thought, a tradition that traced its lineage to the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period, that had been elaborated by thinkers like John Locke and by the radical Whig writers of the early 18th century, and that emphasized the dangers of corruption and tyranny in government, the importance of virtue in citizens and leaders, the fragility of liberty, and the perpetual tendency of power to expand at the expense of freedom. This was a tradition that saw history as a drama of liberty under constant siege, and that read every infringement of constitutional rights, however minor it might appear in isolation, as potentially the first step in a slippery slope toward despotism. Through this interpretive lens, the colonial experience of the 1760s and early 1770s made a kind of terrible sense. The taxes were not merely inconvenient impositions. They were evidence of a design, a deliberate conspiracy, some argued, by corrupt ministers and venal politicians in London, to reduce the colonies to dependence and to strip away the liberties that were their birthright as Englishmen. The soldiers in Boston were not merely an administrative response to disorder. They were the classic instrument of tyranny, the standing army that free governments had always feared, and that despots had always used to enforce their will on a disarmed and helpless population. The removal of colonial officials' dependence on assembly salaries was not merely an administrative reform. It was a calculated assault on one of the last safeguards of colonial self-governance. This interpretive framework required seeing coherence and intention where the reality may have been more often incompetence and improvisation. British policy in this period was not the product of a single coherent mind with a clear design. It was the product of a rapidly changing series of ministries, often internally divided, responding to immediate pressures, financial, commercial, political, without any master plan for the transformation of imperial governance. But the Republican tradition of political thought was not well suited to explanations based on incompetence and muddle. It was a tradition that expected and looked for conspiracy, that read the pattern of events as evidence of design. And the pattern of events in the 1760s was, if one was disposed to read them that way, genuinely alarming. The colonial press was crucial in spreading and deepening this interpretive framework. By the 1760s and 1770s, the colonies had a vigorous newspaper culture, dozens of papers in cities and towns across the continent, many of them willing to publish material that in a more controlled environment would have been seditious. The newspapers were not neutral conveyors of information. They were partisan instruments, and the most influential of them were strongly sympathetic to the resistance movement. They published the political essays of men like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson under various pseudonyms. They reprinted speeches and resolutions from other colonies, helping to create a sense of common cause across boundaries of geography and provincial particularism. They covered every incident of conflict between colonists and royal authority in ways that consistently framed the colonists as aggrieved victims and the authorities as overreaching tyrants. Printers, men like Benjamin Eads and John Gill of the Boston Gazette, were not merely conduits for others' ideas. They were themselves participants in the political networks of resistance, using their craft as a form of activism. The press was, in a very real sense, one of the organizational pillars of the resistance movement, as important in its way as the Sons of Liberty or the correspondence committees in connecting and coordinating colonial opinion. The Committee of Correspondence idea deserves particular attention, because it illustrates the degree to which the resistance leadership was thinking not just about immediate grievances but about the long-term organizational requirements of a sustained political movement. Samuel Adams promoted the formation of a Committee of Correspondence in Boston in 1772, following a period in which British authorities had proposed to pay the salaries of Massachusetts judges from imperial revenue. Another step in the colonial view toward making the judiciary independent of local accountability. The Boston Committee's function was to articulate colonial grievances, circulate those articulations to other Massachusetts towns, and invite responses that would demonstrate the breadth and depth of colonial opposition. The response from dozens of Massachusetts towns was significant. Ordinary communities across the colony expressed their alignment with Boston's concerns, giving the resistance a geographical and social breadth that it had sometimes lacked. The Committee of Correspondence model spread to other colonies. By 1773, most of the colonial assemblies had established their own committees to maintain intercolonial communication and coordination. This was a significant development, the creation of a communications infrastructure that existed in parallel to and independent of the official channels of imperial governance. It was, in a sense, the beginning of an alternative government, though no one at the time would have described it in those terms, and many would have strongly denied any such intention. Into this charged and fragile situation came in 1773, a crisis triggered not by new taxation but by an attempt to help a struggling British company. The East India Company, which held the British monopoly on the trade in Asian goods including tea, was in serious financial difficulty. One of its problems was the enormous quantity of tea sitting unsold in its London warehouses, in part because colonists had been boycotting British tea as a protest against the remaining Townshend duty on it. The Tea Act of 1773 was designed to solve this problem by allowing the East India Company to ship tea directly to the colonies, bypassing the British and colonial middlemen who had previously been part of the distribution chain, and selling it through appointed consignees at a price that, even with the duty included, would undercut the price of smuggled Dutch tea. The logic seemed sound in London. Colonists would get cheaper tea, the East India Company would clear its inventory, and the duty would quietly be accepted as a permanent part of the commercial landscape. What the architects of the plan apparently failed to anticipate was the colonial interpretation of the measure. The appointment of consignees who would have a monopoly on the sale of tea was seen as a threat to the livelihood of colonial merchants who had previously been involved in the tea trade. The cheaper price was seen, with some political sophistication, as a deliberate attempt to bribe colonists into accepting the principle of parliamentary taxation, to make the duty so painlessly embedded in a bargain price that the constitutional objection would be quietly forgotten. And the continued existence of the duty itself was seen as the same assertion of unconstitutional parliamentary power that it had always been. The political networks that had been built and maintained over the preceding decade were activated quickly and effectively. In Philadelphia and New York, the appointed consignees were pressured into resigning before the tea ships arrived. In Boston, the situation was more complex because the consignees, who included relatives of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, refused to resign, and Hutchinson, a man of considerable principle though also of considerable rigidity, refused to allow the ships to leave the harbor without unloading their cargo and paying the duty. This left Boston in a standoff. The tea could not legally be returned to England, and the colonists would not allow it to be landed. The resolution of that standoff came on the night of December 16, 1773, when a group of men, numbering perhaps 100 or more, some of them, though not all, dressed in a rough approximation of Mohawk costume, boarded 3 tea ships and methodically destroyed 342 chests of East India Company tea by throwing them into Boston Harbor. The action was planned and organized, not spontaneous. The leaders of the Boston resistance movement were aware of it and in some cases participants in it, though the specifics of who exactly was there have been debated by historians for more than 2 centuries, partly because the participants themselves were not eager to be identified and many denied involvement for the rest of their lives. The deliberateness and the discipline of the action, the tea was destroyed but nothing else was touched, no ships were damaged, no persons were harmed, were part of its political logic. This was meant to be understood as a principled act of political resistance, not mob destruction. Whether it succeeded in that framing depended entirely on who was doing the interpreting. In London, the Boston Tea Party was received across a wide political spectrum as an act that could not be left unanswered. Even those in Parliament who had sympathy for colonial grievances found it difficult to defend the deliberate destruction of private property. The North Ministry's response was the Coercive Acts of 1774, a series of measures that closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, restructured the government of Massachusetts in ways that severely curtailed colonial self-governance, expanded the Quartering Act, and provided for the trial in Britain of royal officials accused of crimes committed in the line of duty in the colonies. In Massachusetts they were called, with a directness that reflected the colonial reading of their intent, the Intolerable Acts. The Massachusetts Government Act was particularly far-reaching. It eliminated the elected council that had served as the upper house of the Massachusetts legislature, replacing it with one appointed by the Crown. It restricted town meetings, the form of local self-governance that was a fundamental institution of New England civic life. It gave the governor expanded powers over judicial appointments. Taken together, these measures were not merely punitive. They represented a fundamental alteration of the constitutional framework under which Massachusetts had been governed for generations. And here something happened that the British government had not anticipated, or had chosen not to take seriously as a possibility. Instead of isolating Massachusetts as a cautionary example, the coercive acts generated sympathy for Massachusetts throughout the colonies. The other colonies looked at what was being done to Massachusetts and drew the obvious conclusion: if Parliament could unilaterally alter the constitution of one colony as punishment for popular resistance, it could do the same to any colony. The threat was not abstract and distant. It was immediate and particular. Virginia sent supplies to Boston. The correspondence committees were activated to coordinate a response. And in September of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies, all except Georgia, gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The Congress was a remarkable gathering. It included men of very different political temperaments and different degrees of urgency about the crisis, from radicals like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, who believed that a decisive confrontation with British authority was both inevitable and necessary, to moderates and conservatives who still hoped that a firm but dignified statement of colonial rights might produce a negotiated resolution without irreversible rupture. The debates were sometimes fierce and the disagreements real. But the Congress produced a set of documents, declarations of colonial rights, petitions to the king, agreements on non-importation and non-exportation, that represented a coherent colonial position, and it created something unprecedented: a body that could speak for all the colonies together. More importantly, the Congress agreed to reconvene the following spring if the crisis had not been resolved. That agreement was itself significant. It meant that the organizational infrastructure of intercolonial resistance was not being dismantled but extended. It meant that whatever happened next, and both sides understood that something was going to happen next, there would be a structure in place to respond to it. In Massachusetts, the response to the coercive acts had already moved well beyond petitions and declarations. The Colonial Assembly, operating as a de facto body of governance under the name the Provincial Congress, was organizing local militias and beginning to accumulate military supplies. The militias that existed in Massachusetts, as in other colonies, were not professional armies. They were ordinary men, farmers, artisans, tradesmen, who gathered periodically for training and who were supposed to be available for the common defense in emergencies. They were, in military terms, not impressive, but they were armed, they were organized at the local level in ways that were deeply embedded in community life, and they were increasingly motivated. General Thomas Gage, who now served as both commander of British forces in North America and as military governor of Massachusetts, an appointment that itself revealed something about how the British government understood the situation, was a man in an impossible position. He commanded a garrison army in a city surrounded by a hostile countryside. He had orders to enforce laws that the colonial population had made clear it would not obey. He had been told by London that a show of firmness would cow the colonists into submission, an assessment of colonial psychology that his own experience on the ground was giving him reasons to doubt. He repeatedly requested reinforcements that were slow to arrive. And he governed a province in which the established institutions of royal authority were increasingly hollow: judges who could not hold court, customs officials who could not collect duties, laws that existed on paper and nowhere else. The countryside around Boston had become, by the early months of 1775, a place where British authority was largely nominal. The Provincial Congress governed, the militias trained, and the networks of alarm and communication that would allow rapid mobilization were being tested and refined. The colonists called their most ready militia units Minutemen, men who could be ready to respond at a moment's notice, and the name was not merely rhetorical. They were preparing for something, though many of them would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what. And in that preparation, in those cold New England winter months of 1774 and early 1775, something can be seen that is both entirely understandable and enormously significant: the transformation of a political dispute into a military confrontation in all but name. The lines were being drawn not in Parliament or in the pages of newspapers now, but in the stacking of powder kegs in Concord and the drilling of men on the greens of a dozen Massachusetts towns. The personal cost of what was happening was not always visible in the grand narratives of political principle and constitutional argument, but it was real and it was intimate. The coming conflict would divide families: fathers from sons, brothers from brothers, neighbors from neighbors. People who had grown up together, worshipped together, done business together, would find themselves on opposite sides of a line that would only harden as events continued to unfold. The Loyalist families who would eventually be forced into exile, losing their property, their communities, their sense of home, were not abstractions. They were people with the same desires for security and belonging that animated everyone else, people who had simply read the situation differently and made different choices. The merchants who had built their lives on the trade networks of the British Empire watched those networks fray and threaten to snap, and some of them would have given a great deal to find a way back to the comfortable equilibrium of 15 years before. The farmers and artisans who had been politicized by a decade of controversy were often more certain of their course, less burdened by the economic interdependencies that complicated the choices of their wealthier neighbors. The enslaved people who watched all of this unfold from the position of those for whom neither British authority nor colonial self-governance had offered freedom were making their own calculations about what the coming upheaval might mean for them. What comes through in the records of this period, in the letters, the diaries, the newspaper accounts, the legal proceedings, is not the confident purposefulness that later mythology would attribute to the men and women of the revolutionary generation. It is something more human and more troubled: the discomfort of people who have committed themselves to a course of action whose consequences they can sense but not fully foresee, who know that they have passed certain points of no return without being entirely sure when or how they passed them, who are still trying to maintain the fiction that reconciliation is possible even as their own actions are making it less so with each passing month. The Britain that the colonists had claimed to love and emulate was, in their own telling, not the Britain that was now confronting them. The Britain of their self-image was the Britain of the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution, the Britain of constitutional liberty and representative government and the rule of law. The Britain they were actually dealing with, as they experienced it, was a Britain of corrupt ministries and venal parliaments, of soldiers in civilian streets and taxes levied without consent, of a power that would rather coerce than consult. Whether this description of Britain was entirely accurate or was itself partly a product of the interpretive framework through which they were viewing events is a question that historians continue to engage. But it was the description that an increasing number of colonists had come to accept, and it made the emotional and psychological rupture with the mother country progressively easier to contemplate. Thomas Hutchinson, the former governor of Massachusetts who would spend the rest of his life in England after leaving Boston in 1774, never ceased to believe that the crisis had been manufactured and inflamed by a relatively small number of agitators who did not represent the true feelings of the colonial population. There is a sadness in his later writings, an incomprehension at the scale of the disaster that had overtaken a world he had loved and served all his life. He was not a stupid man or an unsympathetic one, and he was not entirely wrong in his diagnosis of particular moments and particular agents, but he could not finally accept that the ideas had taken on a life of their own, that what began as the project of a few organized radicals had become, over the course of a decade of controversy, something that resonated with a much broader colonial experience and that could not be put back in the bottle by the removal of any particular leader or the repeal of any particular law. By the spring of 1775, the British Empire and its American colonies were standing in a place that had been approaching for more than a decade, and the approach had been made through 1,000 individual decisions, each of which seemed manageable at the time and none of which, in retrospect, offered an obvious moment where a different choice would have changed the destination. Perhaps, as some historians have argued, the conflict was in some deep sense inevitable, that the colonial experience of self-governance had created expectations and identities that were incompatible with the tighter imperial system that Britain needed after the 7 Years' War. Perhaps, as others have maintained, it was contingent that different men making different decisions at particular pivotal moments might have found different paths. These are arguments that cannot finally be resolved because history does not run twice so that we can check our work. What can be said is that by the early months of 1775, the situation had a momentum that was very difficult to imagine reversing. The trust that had once made the empire function, the mutual confidence of colonial subjects and imperial authority that allowed laws to be obeyed without direct coercion, that made the whole elaborate structure of self-governance within empire work, had been damaged beyond easy repair. On both sides, the working assumption was no longer that the other side intended good faith and shared a common understanding of the proper framework for resolving disputes. On both sides, the question was increasingly not how to restore what had been lost but how to prepare for what seemed to be coming. The militia companies were drilling. The powder was being stored. The correspondence committees were sending their messages from town to town and colony to colony. General Gage was writing his frustrating dispatches to London. Samuel Adams was attending sessions of the Provincial Congress. Farmers in the villages of Concord and Lexington were going about the work of early spring in a landscape that was, outwardly, much as it had always been. The same fields, the same familiar paths, the same cold mornings and the first tentative signs of another New England thaw. But something had changed in the quality of the air, in the way people looked at one another when they passed in the road, in the weight of the silence that fell in conversations when certain subjects arose. Something that had once felt solid and settled, the relationship between these people and the empire they had believed was theirs as much as anyone's, had been revealed to be neither as solid nor as settled as it had seemed. And in that revelation, in that particular knowledge that a world familiar and sustaining might be ending, was a kind of gravity that no amount of political argument or legal reasoning could fully lighten. The spring of 1775 was coming, and with it, something that had not yet been named but that everyone could feel gathering at the edge of the familiar world, the way that a storm can be felt in the air before a single cloud appears on the horizon, present and unmistakable and, for all the wishing otherwise, already inevitable. The feeling that something is coming and the arrival of that something are separated, sometimes by only the thinnest membrane of ordinary time. In the early months of 1775, that membrane was still intact but barely. People on both sides of the growing divide were making preparations that they described to themselves in defensive terms. They were not starting anything, only making ready for what the other side might do, and in that mutual preparation, the very conflict each side claimed not to want was being assembled, piece by piece, with the careful deliberateness of men who no longer believed in the possibility of peace, but had not yet brought themselves to say so plainly. The political events of the preceding year had moved quickly enough that many ordinary colonists found themselves in positions they had not consciously chosen. A farmer in Worcester County, Massachusetts, who had signed a petition against the Stamp Act nearly a decade earlier and then returned to his fields when the immediate crisis passed, was now living in a province whose legal government had been suspended, whose courts had largely ceased to function, and whose militias were being told to be ready. He had not decided in any single moment to become a revolutionary. He had simply continued, one step at a time, to align himself with the side of the argument that felt most consistent with his experience and his sense of right, and that series of small alignments had carried him, without his quite noticing, to the edge of something that had no comfortable name yet. This was true for many people, and it is one of the things that makes this period in history at once so understandable and so difficult to reduce to a clean narrative. Revolutions, in the making of them, rarely feel like revolutions. They feel like a series of disputes and decisions and grievances and responses, each connected to the last, each seeming at the time like an episode rather than a chapter in something much larger. It is only in retrospect that the shape of the whole becomes visible, and by then the people who lived through it have often already supplied the shape themselves, in memory and in story, smoothing away the confusion and the doubt that were the actual texture of the experience. In London, the government of Lord North was under pressure from multiple directions. There were voices in Parliament, Edmund Burke most eloquently among them, and also William Pitt the Elder, now the Earl of Chatham, who argued that the punitive approach to the colonies was both unjust and counterproductive, that the coercive acts would not cow the Americans into submission but would inflame them into resistance, and that the proper course was a genuine accommodation of colonial grievances. These were not voices without influence. Burke's speeches on American taxation and on conciliation with America were among the most powerful parliamentary addresses of the century, and they articulated a vision of empire based on affection and shared interest rather than coercion and command. But they did not, ultimately, prevail. The dominant sentiment in Parliament and in the ministry was that firmness was required, that any concession made in the face of colonial violence and defiance would be read as weakness and would only encourage further disorder. King George III, for his part, had concluded by the autumn of 1775 that the colonies were in a state of rebellion and must be treated accordingly. He was not, as some later caricatures would have it, a particularly tyrannical figure by the standards of the era. He was in many respects a conscientious monarch who took his constitutional responsibilities seriously. But he was also a man of considerable stubbornness, and the colonial challenge to parliamentary authority struck him as an existential threat to the integrity of the empire and the principle of ordered governance that he had pledged to uphold. He was not inclined toward accommodation, and his support for a policy of suppression was firm and consistent. The petition that the First Continental Congress had sent to the king, the Olive Branch Petition, as it came to be called after a second such petition was sent by the Second Continental Congress in July of 1775, was received with a coldness that ended any remaining hope that the constitutional dispute could be resolved through negotiation. The king refused to receive the petition formally, and the ministry declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. From the royal perspective, there was nothing to negotiate. The colonists had broken the law, destroyed property, resisted royal authority, and armed themselves against the crown. The proper response was not discussion but restoration of order by force. This mutual hardening of positions had been building for months before the first shots were actually fired, and the shots when they came were in some ways almost anticlimactic, not because they were not momentous, but because the preparations on both sides had been so transparent that the only surprise was the exact form and timing of the event itself. General Gage had been involved in intelligence about colonial military preparations in the Massachusetts countryside. He knew, or had been told, that the provincial Congress had been accumulating military stores in Concord, a town about 15 miles northwest of Boston. They were under pressure from London to act decisively, to arrest the principal leaders of the resistance, to demonstrate that royal authority was real and enforceable. Whether he could have done so more effectively under different circumstances is a question that military historians have discussed at length. What he decided to do in the event was to send a column of soldiers to seize or destroy the military supplies at Concord and possibly to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were known to be in the area. The expedition was planned as a surprise, and its secrecy was imperfect almost from the beginning. Boston in 1775 was a city under military occupation in which information moved in both directions with considerable efficiency, and the colonial resistance networks had become skilled at watching for signs of British military activity. On the night of April 18, as the British column began its movement by boat across the Charles River, and then on foot toward the countryside, the alarm system that had been prepared for exactly this contingency was activated. Paul Revere and William Dawes, and later Samuel Prescott, rode through the night to warn the countryside that the British regulars were on the march. The signal that was to be displayed in the steeple of the Old North Church, 1 lantern if the troops were coming by land, 2 if by sea, meaning across the Charles River, is one of the most famous details in the entire history of the Revolution, partly because of the way it was dramatized by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in a poem written more than 80 years after the event. Longfellow's version of the ride of Paul Revere has the kind of narrative clarity and emotional force that actual events rarely achieve, and it has shaped popular understanding of that night in ways that historians have spent considerable effort complicating and correcting. What is clear from more contemporaneous accounts is that the warning system worked, that multiple riders were involved, and that the countryside was alerted in time for militia companies to mobilize. The British column, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, arrived at the town of Lexington in the early hours of April 19, 1775, and found a company of militia, roughly 70 men under Captain John Parker, assembled on the town green. What happened next has been debated almost from the moment it occurred. Who fired the first shot is a question that witnesses disagreed about at the time, and that historians have never been able to resolve definitively. The British officers present maintained that the militia fired first. Surviving colonial participants and witnesses maintained that the British fired without provocation. The physical and documentary evidence is insufficient to settle the question one way or the other with certainty. What is not disputed is the outcome. The militia on Lexington Green was badly outnumbered and, after a brief and chaotic exchange, scattered. 8 militiamen were killed and 10 wounded. One British soldier was slightly wounded. The British column reformed and marched on toward Concord. At Concord, the situation was different. More militia had gathered, companies from Concord itself and from several surrounding towns, and the colonial force numbered perhaps 400 men by the time the confrontation at the North Bridge occurred. The British detachment sent to secure the bridge found itself facing a colonial force that outnumbered it and that, after shots were exchanged, pushed it back. The specific sequence of events at the North Bridge, who gave what orders, who fired first, how the confrontation escalated, is, again, something that the historical record does not resolve with complete clarity. What is clear is that the British were retreating from Concord by midday, and that the retreat back to Boston became something very different from the disciplined withdrawal of a professional army. The countryside had been alerted. Militia companies were converging from towns across the region, and those companies were fighting in ways that the British column was not well prepared to counter. Rather than forming up in the open field battles that European military doctrine and training assumed, the colonial militiamen used the terrain, the trees and stone walls and buildings along the road, to fire at the British column from cover and then melt away before a counterattack could be organized. Whether this was a matter of deliberate tactical choice or simply the natural behavior of men fighting in familiar terrain, it was devastatingly effective. By the time the column reached Lexington, where a relief force under Hugh Percy had been sent to support the original expedition, it was in serious difficulty. The combined force eventually made it back to Charlestown in safety, but the cost had been severe. Total British casualties for the day, killed, wounded, and missing, numbered in the hundreds by most accounts, while colonial casualties, though also significant, were substantially lower. The Battle of Lexington and Concord, or the battles as they are more precisely described, was not a large engagement by the standards of conventional 18th century warfare. It was, in military terms, a skirmish and a confused retreat. But its significance was enormous, and not primarily because of what it accomplished militarily. It was significant because it happened, because British soldiers and colonial militiamen had killed each other, and that fact could not be undone. The membrane that had separated the political crisis from open violence had been punctured, and the world that existed before the morning of April 19, 1775, could not be recovered. The news spread through the colonies with remarkable speed, remarkable given the communication technology of the era, carried by riders along well-established post roads and by ships along the coast. The colonial account of what had happened, framed, as was almost inevitable, from the colonial perspective, with emphasis on British aggression and colonial defensive action, reached communities throughout New England within days and the other colonies within weeks. Whatever hope had remained for a peaceful resolution of the constitutional dispute was consumed in the reporting of those first deaths on the road between Lexington and Concord. Around Boston, the situation moved quickly from a single clash to something approaching a siege. The militia companies that had assembled on April 19 did not simply disband and return to their farms when the British column retreated. They camped. More men arrived. Within days, a colonial force of thousands had assembled on the hills and fields around Boston, surrounding the city and the British garrison inside it. This was an improvised army in almost every sense, lacking unified command, lacking adequate supply systems, lacking the institutional structure and discipline of a professional military force. But it was there, and its presence made Boston effectively a besieged city. The Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia in May of 1775, and the delegates who arrived did so in a political world that had been transformed since their last meeting. They had gathered the previous autumn as colonial politicians seeking redress of constitutional grievances through petition and economic pressure. They were gathering now as representatives of colonies at war, or at something that looked very much like war, with the country's governing power. The transformation in the nature of their task was enormous, and not all of the delegates were equally prepared to accept what it meant. The Congress faced, from its opening days, the fundamental question of what kind of body it was and what kind of authority it had. It had not been created by any legal instrument or constitutional provision. It was, in a formal sense, an entirely extra-legal gathering, representatives of colonial assemblies meeting without any sanction from imperial law and claiming, by necessity and by the logic of the situation, powers that had never been formally granted to anyone. The fact that it proceeded to exercise those powers, to raise armies, to issue currency, to conduct diplomacy, to make war and eventually to seek peace, is one of the more remarkable things about the entire Revolutionary period. The Congress governed by consent and by the force of shared crisis, and for a surprisingly long time, that was enough. One of the earliest and most consequential decisions the Congress made was the appointment of a commander-in-chief for what was being organized, with some optimism, as a Continental Army. The Massachusetts militia around Boston needed to be incorporated into something that could claim to speak for all the colonies, and the colonies needed to demonstrate to themselves and to the world that their military effort was more than a New England affair. The political logic pointed clearly toward a commander from the South, someone whose appointment would symbolize the continental character of the cause, and whose credentials would lend it military credibility. George Washington of Virginia was nominated by John Adams of Massachusetts, and the choice, in retrospect, seems almost inevitable. Washington was 43 years old, tall and physically imposing in the way that contemporaries found commanding, a veteran of the French and Indian War with more actual military experience than almost anyone else the Congress could have considered, a man of considerable wealth and social standing whose commitment to the cause would signal to the other propertied classes that this was not a movement of rabble and demagogues. He was also, critically, a man of apparent personal character, dignified, controlled, capable of inspiring confidence, whose public persona embodied the kind of virtuous republicanism that the Revolution claimed to represent. Washington himself, according to his own account and the accounts of those who knew him, accepted the command with a genuine humility that was not entirely performed. He told the Congress that he felt himself inadequate to the task, that he was entering a sphere of action in which he might fail, and that he would serve without pay, accepting only the reimbursement of his expenses. These sentiments were entirely consistent with the Republican ethos that idealized the citizen soldier who sacrificed private interests for public duty, and Washington appears to have believed them, at least in significant part. Whether he was also aware that the public expression of reluctance and humility was itself a form of political theater that served his interests, whether, that is, the private Washington was as modest as the public Washington appeared, is a question that biographers have wrestled with for generations without reaching a definitive consensus. What is clear is that the task awaiting him when he arrived at Cambridge, Massachusetts, in early July of 1775 was considerably more daunting than even he may have anticipated. The army encamped around Boston was, by the standards of any professional military observer, barely an army at all. It was a collection of militia units from different colonies, each with their own officers, their own organizational structures, their own particular ideas about discipline and authority. The men came from backgrounds that predisposed them to question orders they disagreed with. They were free farmers and artisans, not the landless laborers and urban poor who filled the ranks of European armies, and they had opinions about how they should be treated that did not always accord well with the requirements of military discipline. Enlistments were short, often no more than a few months, which meant that the army was in constant flux, its experienced men going home and being replaced by raw recruits who needed to be trained while the veterans who might train them were preparing to leave. Supplies were inadequate. Artillery was desperately scarce. Powder was so short at certain points during the summer of 1775 that the army could barely have sustained a major engagement. Before Washington even fully arrived at his new command, the war around Boston had produced one of its most significant early engagements. In June of 1775, colonial forces had moved to occupy Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula, north of Boston, in an effort to strengthen their siege lines and threaten the British position. The British response, a frontal assault on the colonial fortifications, resulted in what came to be known, somewhat confusingly, as the Battle of Bunker Hill, though most of the fighting actually took place on Breed's Hill. The British took the position eventually, but at a cost in casualties that shocked observers on both sides. The colonial defenders, who were ultimately forced to retreat when they ran out of powder rather than by direct defeat, demonstrated that American militia could hold well-prepared positions against professional assault with enormous effectiveness. British officer casualties in particular were severe. Bunker Hill was not a colonial victory in the conventional military sense. The British held the field at the end of the day, and the strategic position of the siege was not fundamentally altered. But it established something important about the character of this conflict that would recur throughout the war: that American forces fighting defensively in prepared positions could inflict very heavy casualties on British regulars, and that winning in America was going to require much more than the British government had so far been willing to commit. The lesson was clear enough. It was not universally absorbed. Washington spent the summer and autumn of 1775 trying to transform his collection of militia companies into something resembling a functional army, and the difficulties were unrelenting. Discipline was a constant problem. Men who had signed up to defend their communities from British tyranny did not always see the connection between that purpose and the seemingly arbitrary requirements of military hierarchy, and getting them to follow orders they found inconvenient required a kind of patient, persistent authority that Washington worked to cultivate while privately expressing in his correspondence a frustration that was sometimes close to despair. The short-term enlistments meant that just as a unit had been drilled to something approaching effectiveness, its men's terms expired and they went home. The question of whether new enlistments could be obtained was a permanent anxiety. The supply situation was managed, in part, by a remarkable feat of logistics in the winter of 1775 to 1776. Henry Knox, a young Boston bookseller turned artillery officer with no formal military training but considerable reading in military theory, and an apparently inexhaustible supply of practical energy, organized the transport of cannon and mortars captured at Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, where Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys had seized the post from its small British garrison in May 1775. Across the frozen lakes and mountains and snow-covered roads of winter New England to the siege lines around Boston. The achievement was remarkable in its sheer physical difficulty, and the artillery it delivered transformed the strategic situation. By March of 1776, Washington was able to use Knox's cannon to fortify Dorchester Heights, which commanded both the harbor and much of Boston. The British commander, General William Howe, who had replaced Gage in October of 1775, found himself in an untenable position. His garrison could not effectively fire back on the heights, and his fleet was vulnerable. Faced with a choice between a costly assault on well-fortified high ground, Howe knew what assaulting fortified heights cost from his experience at Bunker Hill, and evacuation. He chose evacuation. In March of 1776, the British forces withdrew from Boston, taking with them roughly 1,000 loyalists who did not feel safe remaining in a city that had become so definitively hostile to everything they represented. Boston did not see British forces again for the remainder of the war. Washington had achieved, in the siege, something genuine. He had forced the evacuation of a major city with artillery and determination, without the frontal assault that would have cost him casualties he could not afford. It was not a dramatic battlefield victory, but it was a meaningful strategic success, and it demonstrated something important about his approach to the war. A preference, which would become characteristic, for achieving results through maneuver and position rather than through head-on confrontation with an enemy that had advantages in training, discipline, and supply. But the broader situation, as the spring of 1776 arrived, was deeply uncertain. The British were not withdrawing from the war. They were repositioning. Howe's forces would reappear, reinforced and resupplied, and the question of where they would strike next was one that Washington could not answer with confidence. The colonies were at war with the most powerful empire in the world, an empire with the resources to sustain a much longer and more intense conflict than anything yet seen, and the Continental Army remained fragile and underfunded and dependent on the continued willingness of men to enlist and serve in conditions that were often miserable. The question of what the war was actually for, what success would mean and what the colonies were trying to achieve, was one that had not yet been fully answered, at least not publicly. Through most of 1775, the official position of the Congress was still, at least nominally, that the colonies were fighting not for independence but for the restoration of their constitutional rights within the British Empire. Petitions to the king continued to be sent. Reconciliation was nominally the goal. But the logic of the military situation was making that position increasingly difficult to sustain, and the ideas that would eventually produce a definitive break were already circulating in powerful form. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, published in January of 1776, was one of the most effective pieces of political writing in the history of the English language, and its effect on colonial public opinion was immediate and substantial. Paine was an Englishman who had come to the colonies only in 1774, bringing with him the perspective of a man who had experienced the class-bound society of England without the cushioning that wealth and status provided, and he had none of the attachment to the idea of the British connection that even many patriot colonists still felt. His argument was blunt and unequivocal in a way that more genteel colonial writers had avoided. Monarchy was absurd as a system of government, the British Constitution was not the glorious achievement its admirers claimed, and the proper conclusion from everything that had happened was not reconciliation but independence. Common sense reportedly sold in enormous numbers relative to the colonial population. Estimates have varied considerably, and the precise figures are not certain, but the pamphlet clearly reached a readership of exceptional breadth, circulating through communities that might not normally have engaged with political literature. It put into plain, accessible language what many people had been thinking but not saying, and it made the case for independence seem not like a radical and dangerous leap into the unknown but like the obvious and sensible conclusion of a colonial experience that had already demonstrated the impossibility of a satisfactory relationship with Britain. The transformation of colonial opinion from protest to independence was not instantaneous, and it was not uniform. There were still colonists in the spring of 1776 who hoped for some form of reconciliation, who believed that independence was too drastic and too risky a step, that the ties of culture and commerce and history with Britain were too deep and too valuable to be severed, that the war might yet produce a negotiated settlement short of permanent separation. These were not all loyalists in the committed sense. Many of them were people who genuinely supported the colonial constitutional position, but who drew back from the final conclusion that the resistance leadership was now openly advocating. The Loyalists themselves constituted a significant portion of the colonial population, though historians continue to debate their actual numbers and social distribution. The estimates that have been offered range widely, and the difficulties of counting loyalism are compounded by the fact that loyalty was not always a permanent condition. People moved between positions depending on circumstances, fortunes, personal relationships, and local pressures. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that loyalism is not a marginal phenomenon, and not confined to any single social class or region. There were working-class loyalists and wealthy loyalists, loyalists in New England and loyalists in the South, loyalists who had been born in Britain and loyalists whose families had been in the colonies for generations. What united them was a conviction that independence was wrong, constitutionally, morally, practically. Some believed genuinely that the colonial constitutional argument was legally incorrect, and that parliamentary sovereignty was a legitimate and necessary principle of governance. Some believed that an independent America would be ungovernable, that the social order that protected them and their interests would dissolve without the framework of imperial law and authority. Some had personal connections, family, commerce, friendship, with people in Britain or in the official structures of imperial governance that made the idea of permanent separation feel like a personal as well as political loss. And some, particularly in regions with significant enslaved populations, feared that a successful revolution against British authority might also become a revolution against other forms of established hierarchy, including the system of slavery that undergirded their entire world. The Loyalists who were most exposed to popular pressure, those in communities where patriot sentiment was dominant and organized, faced choices that were often brutal. To continue expressing loyalty to the crown was to invite harassment, social ostracism, property destruction, and sometimes physical violence. The tar and feathering of loyalists who were seen as particularly outspoken or dangerous was not an isolated phenomenon. The communal pressure to conform to the patriot position, to sign oaths, to participate in local militia structures, to publicly renounce attachment to the crown, was intense, and those who could not or would not comply often found their options narrowing to flight or endurance under conditions of increasing hostility. Many chose flight. Throughout the war, Loyalists left their homes and communities in substantial numbers, for British-occupied cities like New York and Philadelphia during the periods of British control, for Canada, for the Caribbean, for Britain itself. The scale of this Loyalist diaspora was significant. Estimates of the total number of people who left the newly independent states during and after the Revolution have ranged from 60,000 to perhaps twice that, though these figures are uncertain. For those who left, the experience was generally one of loss of property, of community, of the sense of belonging to a place in a society that had been theirs. Many who went to Britain found that the country they had claimed as their own received them with a mixture of sympathy and condescension, recognizing them as victims of a political disaster without being entirely sure what to do with them. Others went to Nova Scotia and the Canadian interior, founding communities that carried with them the particular identity of people displaced by a revolution they had opposed. The America that was emerging from the revolutionary crisis was not the America of any single coherent vision. It was contested, plural, and shot through with contradictions that would persist long after the immediate crisis of independence was resolved. The most fundamental of those contradictions, the fact that a revolution fought in the name of liberty and self-determination was being prosecuted by a society that held hundreds of thousands of people in hereditary chattel slavery, was visible and acknowledged, though the ways in which different people acknowledged it varied enormously. Some, like Jefferson, felt its weight deeply while simultaneously finding ways to avoid the personal and political consequences of confronting it directly. Others, particularly in New England, began to move slowly and unevenly toward a position that saw the abolition of slavery as a necessary implication of the principles the Revolution claimed to represent. Others, particularly in the Southern colonies, found ways to argue that slavery and liberty were not in contradiction, or simply declined to think about the question at all. The enslaved people themselves, perhaps 1 in 5 of the total colonial population, were not passive observers of events that were ostensibly about someone else's freedom. They were making their own calculations and their own choices, insofar as their constrained circumstances allowed. In November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person belonging to a rebel owner who could escape and reach British lines. The Dunmore Proclamation was not a humanitarian gesture. It was explicitly limited to the enslaved property of those in rebellion against the crown, not of loyalists, and it was motivated primarily by the desire to destabilize the rebel economy and provide the British with useful labor and military recruits. But its effect on the enslaved population was real. Thousands of people attempted to reach British lines throughout the war, at enormous personal risk, motivated by the possibility of freedom that the proclamation represented. The response of the planter class to Dunmore's proclamation was fury, and it hardened the commitment of many Virginia gentry to the revolutionary cause who might otherwise have continued to hesitate. Men who had been uncertain about independence became more certain when they contemplated the possibility of their enslaved labor force being liberated by British policy. This was not a noble motivation, and it is worth noting plainly as part of the full complexity of this history. The Declaration of Independence, formally adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, was the document that finally made the break with Britain explicit and gave it a philosophical foundation. Jefferson's draft had been debated and revised by the Congress, with some of the more pointed passages, including an original denunciation of the slave trade that Jefferson himself had included and that the Congress removed, apparently at the insistence of South Carolina and Georgia, altered or deleted. The document that emerged was a statement of political philosophy as much as a declaration of legal separation, grounded in the natural rights tradition that had been circulating through Enlightenment thought for a century, and that held that all men were created equal and possessed inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The phrase "all men are created equal" was not, in its 1776 context, understood to mean what it would later come to mean, or be claimed to mean by those who read it as a founding commitment to universal human equality. The men who wrote it and signed it did not, with a few exceptions, apply it to the enslaved people they owned or to the women in their households or to the indigenous nations whose lands they occupied. But the phrase contained within it a tension, an aspiration, a moral logic that would outlive its author's intentions and become one of the central instruments of later struggles for equality that the founders of 1776 had not envisioned and would not have recognized as theirs. The Declaration also served an immediate and practical political purpose. It defined the war as a war for independence and made reconciliation with Britain under the old terms impossible. There could no longer be any ambiguity about what the Continental Congress was trying to achieve. The colonies, now styling themselves states, were claiming sovereignty, and that claim would either be vindicated by military success or extinguished by defeat. The summer of 1776 provided immediate and sobering evidence of just how difficult the vindication was going to be. While the Congress was still celebrating the adoption of the Declaration, the British were assembling off the coast of New York the largest expeditionary force in the history of British arms to that point, approximately 30,000 soldiers, supported by a naval fleet of corresponding strength. General Howe had chosen New York as his target because its harbor made it the ideal base for British naval operations, because it sat at the geographical center of the colonies and could be used to divide New England from the south, and because the large Loyalist population in New York and its surroundings offered the prospect of a friendlier reception than Massachusetts had provided. Washington had anticipated the move to New York and had moved his army there from Boston. But what awaited him was a military situation far more challenging than anything he had yet encountered. The British force that landed on Long Island in late August of 1776 was larger, better trained, better equipped, and better supplied than anything Washington could put in the field. The Battle of Long Island, fought on August 27, 1776, was a serious defeat for the American forces. British and Hessian troops, Germany's Hessian states had supplied hired soldiers to supplement the British army, a practice that colonial propagandists pointed to as further evidence of British tyranny, executed a flanking maneuver that caught Washington's left wing unsupported and inflicted heavy casualties. What followed the defeat at Long Island was a retreat that required Washington and his commanders to make difficult decisions quickly, and the fact that the Continental Army survived those decisions was itself a significant achievement. The withdrawal of the army from Long Island across the East River in the darkness of August 29 to 30, carried out in small boats through a fog that concealed the operation from British observation, was executed without the loss of the men or the guns, and it was the kind of practical military competence under pressure that suggested Washington was more than simply a figurehead. But the army was in retreat, and it stayed in retreat for most of the autumn of 1776. The British pushed through Manhattan, then up into Westchester County, and Washington's forces fell back ahead of them in a series of engagements that were, individually, defeats, though the army preserved itself as a fighting force through its willingness to run when running was the sensible option. Fort Washington on the northern tip of Manhattan fell in November 1776 with the loss of nearly 3,000 American prisoners, one of the worst single losses of the war for the Continental cause. The subsequent retreat across New Jersey was, in the accounts of those who participated in it, a grim and demoralizing experience, the army shrinking as men whose enlistments had expired went home and as others, exhausted and despairing, simply melted away. Thomas Paine, who had accompanied the army on part of the retreat, wrote a pamphlet in December 1776 that began with words that have echoed through the history of the Revolution. He wrote of the times that try men's souls, of the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot who shrink from the service of their country in crisis. The crisis, as the pamphlet was called, was read aloud to Washington's troops and was widely distributed, and its effect on morale was reportedly significant. But morale alone would not solve the military situation, and by December of 1776, that situation had deteriorated to a point that seemed, to many observers, to mark the effective end of the American military effort. Washington thought otherwise, and what he did next would become one of the most celebrated events of the entire war. On the night of December 25 to 26, 1776, in conditions of cold and ice and darkness that should have made the operation impossible, Washington led approximately 2,400 men across the Delaware River and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey before dawn. The Hessian force, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, was surprised and overwhelmed in a brief and one-sided engagement. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. American casualties were extraordinarily light. The victory at Trenton was followed by another engagement at Princeton on January 3, 1777, in which Washington's forces outmaneuvered a British force under Cornwallis and inflicted another reversal. Together, the battles of Trenton and Princeton were not large engagements, but their strategic and psychological significance was immense. They demonstrated that the Continental Army could still fight effectively, could achieve significant results against professional forces, and could be led with the kind of creative boldness that transformed desperate circumstances into opportunities. They reinvigorated enlistments, restored something of the public confidence that the autumn disasters had eroded, and established Washington's reputation as a commander in a way that the earlier retreats had threatened to undermine permanently. The war's larger shape, however, remained deeply uncertain. The British strategy for 1777 involved an ambitious plan to divide the colonies permanently by seizing control of the Hudson River corridor, the line of water and land running from New York City north through Albany to Lake Champlain, which was the geographical spine separating New England from the middle and southern colonies. If the British could control that corridor, the thinking went, they could prevent coordination between the colonial regions and perhaps negotiate separately with a New England that had been cut off from its allies. The plan required coordination between forces moving south from Canada under General John Burgoyne and forces moving north from New York under Howe. The coordination failed in part because of communication delays and in part because Howe made the fateful decision to move against Philadelphia rather than north up the Hudson, a decision whose reasoning has been debated by military historians ever since. Burgoyne moved south from Canada through the summer of 1777 in command of a force that included British regulars, Hessian troops, Canadian militia, and Indigenous allies, and he had early successes, recapturing Fort Ticonderoga in July and pushing American forces before him. But the campaign south from Canada was one of extraordinary logistical difficulty. The terrain through which Burgoyne's army moved, the forests and swamps and lakes of upstate New York, was punishing, and as the army moved further from its Canadian base, its supply lines stretched thinner and became more vulnerable. The American forces opposing Burgoyne were largely militia and Continental Army units under the command of General Philip Schuyler and later General Horatio Gates, and they used the terrain and the distances to their advantage, falling back rather than risking decisive engagement and working to interpose themselves between Burgoyne and his objective. The battle at Bennington in August 1777, in which American forces under John Stark decisively defeated a Hessian detachment sent to gather supplies, was an early sign of Burgoyne's mounting difficulties. By September, his army was at the Hudson River but had been unable to receive the supplies and reinforcements it needed, and American forces had gathered in strength at Bemis Heights, south of Saratoga, blocking his path. The battles of Saratoga were fought in two major engagements, on September 19 and October 7, 1777. The details of the fighting are complex, involving terrain and tactics, and the leadership of multiple commanders on both sides. What became central to the historical memory of the battle was the role of Benedict Arnold, a Connecticut-born general of genuine military talent, whose complicated relationship with the Continental Congress and with his own ambitions and grievances would eventually lead him to one of the most notorious acts of treason in American history. At Saratoga, however, Arnold fought on the American side with ferocity and skill that most accounts credit as crucial to the American success, charging repeatedly into the thick of the fighting despite orders that were disputed and a wound that eventually cost him his leg's full function. The precise details of his role and the orders under which he operated have been interpreted differently by different historians, and the fact that he later defected to the British has inevitably colored the way his earlier service has been evaluated and remembered. The result of Saratoga was unambiguous. On October 17, 1777, General John Burgoyne surrendered his entire remaining army, nearly 6,000 men, to General Horatio Gates. It was one of the largest capitulations in British military history, and its consequences extended far beyond the military situation in upstate New York. The news of Saratoga reached Paris in December of 1777, and produced exactly the effect that American diplomats had been working toward for more than a year. France had been watching the American Revolution with intense interest, both because the defeat of Britain would be enormously advantageous for French interests, which had been severely damaged by the 7 Years' War, and because there were members of the French government and aristocracy who felt genuine sympathy for what they perceived as a struggle for liberty against British tyranny. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French aristocrat of wealth and considerable military ambition, had come to America in 1777 without official French support, having purchased his own ship and persuaded enough companions to fill it, driven by a combination of idealism and appetite for military glory that was characteristic of his generation and class. He had joined Washington's staff and distinguished himself in early actions, and his presence was a symbol of the sympathy that important elements of French society felt for the American cause. But sympathy was not the same as alliance, and the French government, advised by the formidable Foreign Minister Vergennes, was not prepared to commit openly to the American side as long as the outcome of the war remained genuinely doubtful. Supporting a losing rebellion would bring all the costs of a war with Britain without any of the benefits of victory. The news of Saratoga changed the calculation. An American army had demonstrated that it could defeat a British force in a major engagement, capturing an entire army in the field. The possibility that the Americans might actually win was no longer theoretical. In February of 1778, France signed treaties of commerce and alliance with the United States, committing France to support American independence and agreeing that neither country would make peace with Britain without the consent of the other. It was a transformation of the strategic situation of the most fundamental kind. The war that had begun as a colonial rebellion against imperial authority was now a war in which one of the two greatest military powers in Europe had committed itself to the American side. Spain would follow in 1779, though with somewhat different goals and a more ambiguous relationship to American independence. The Netherlands would be drawn into conflict with Britain by 1780. What had begun as an American problem was becoming a British problem of truly global dimensions. The French alliance brought real and immediate benefits. French money helped sustain continental finances that were chronically strained. French naval power began to challenge British control of the seas, which had been a fundamental British advantage throughout the war. The ability to move troops and supplies by sea with a speed and reliability that the Americans could not match by land. And French military expertise, equipment, and eventually soldiers would contribute directly to the land campaign. But the alliance was not a guarantee of anything, and the winter of 1777 to 1778, which Washington's army spent at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, was a demonstration of how far the Continental Army still had to go before it could claim genuine military effectiveness by professional standards. Valley Forge has entered American historical memory as a symbol of suffering and endurance, a place where men went hungry and barefoot in the snow, where disease killed more soldiers than British bullets had all year, where the army seemed to be dissolving through sheer privation and neglect. The suffering at Valley Forge was real, and the failures of the supply system that caused it were real failures of organization and administration and political will on the part of the Congress and the states that left soldiers without adequate food, clothing, and shelter in the middle of winter. But something else happened at Valley Forge alongside the suffering. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben, who had embellished his credentials somewhat before presenting himself to Washington, though his actual military knowledge was genuine and substantial, spent the winter training the Continental Army in the drill and discipline of European professional warfare. The drilling was adapted to American conditions and to American soldiers who were not European peasants with a lifetime's habit often questioning obedience, and Steuben had a gift for the work, for breaking down complex maneuvers into comprehensible components, for inspiring rather than merely commanding, for understanding that American soldiers needed to be persuaded of the usefulness of what they were being asked to do rather than simply ordered to do it. The army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was, in military terms, measurably better than the army that had entered it in November. However, it continued to evolve in ways that revealed the deep structural difficulties on both sides. The British strategy shifted after Saratoga and the French alliance. The arrival of the new commander coincided with a strategic reassessment. Holding Philadelphia, which the British had occupied since September of 1777 after the Battle of Brandywine, was no longer sustainable once French naval power had to be taken into account, and Clinton evacuated the city in June of 1778, marching his army overland through New Jersey back toward New York. Washington pursued and attacked the British column at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, one of the largest battles of the war, fought in brutal summer heat that may have killed as many men as the fighting itself. The engagement ended inconclusively, with the British continuing their march to New York and Washington maintaining his ground, but the performance of the Continental troops demonstrated the improvements in training and discipline that Valley Forge had produced. The war in the North settled into something of a stalemate after Monmouth, with Clinton's army based in New York and Washington's forces watching it from positions in New Jersey and the Hudson Highlands. Neither side had the strength to deliver a decisive blow. The British could not bring Washington to a set-piece battle he could not win. Washington could not assault New York's formidable defenses. The conflict ground on in raids and skirmishes and small engagements, wearing at both sides without producing the decisive moment that would determine the outcome. What changed was the shifting of British strategic attention southward. The British government and its commanders had come to believe that there was a substantial loyalist population in the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, that, if properly supported, could provide a base for reconquering the South and rolling the rebellion back from below. The Southern strategy, as it came to be called, would dominate the last years of the war, and its early phases were distinctly favorable to the British. Savannah fell to British forces in December of 1778. Charleston, South Carolina, the largest city in the South, fell in May of 1780 after a siege, with the surrender of nearly 5,000 Continental troops under Benjamin Lincoln, the worst single American military defeat of the entire war. The patriot cause in the South appeared, for a time, to be collapsing. But running beneath and through all of these military events was the continuing transformation of what this war meant to the people who were living through it. And that transformation is as important as any battlefield development in understanding what the revolution actually was. The experience of ordinary people during the war years was shaped not by grand strategic decisions or ideological declarations, but by the immediate, practical, and sometimes terrifying realities of a conflict that was simultaneously a war of armies and a civil war within communities. In many parts of the country, particularly in the middle and southern colonies, where Loyalist sentiment was strongest and where the fighting was most bitter and protracted, the revolution was experienced not primarily as a war against British regulars but as a conflict among neighbors. Families divided. Brothers found themselves on opposite sides. Communities that had lived together in imperfect but genuine harmony found those relationships ruptured by the demands of loyalty and the passions of war. The violence of this internal conflict could be savage. In the Carolinas particularly, the partisan warfare that developed as the formal military situation shifted back and forth was characterized by reprisals and counter-reprisals, by the burning of farms and the killing of prisoners, by atrocities committed by both sides that left communities scarred in ways that outlasted the formal end of the conflict by decades. The word war encompasses these things as well as the pitched battles and the formal sieges, and any account of the revolution that focuses only on the military history risks missing something essential about what the conflict actually cost the people who lived through it. Women bore burdens that the history of the revolution has not always fully acknowledged. With men away at war, or away fleeing Loyalist retribution, or away in British prisons, women managed farms and businesses and households in conditions of uncertainty and often genuine danger. They made economic decisions and community decisions that in peacetime would have been designated as male prerogatives. They provided food and supplies to armies passing through their communities, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes under compulsion, and they coped with the inflation and shortages that the war economy produced in ways that required constant improvisation. The women who followed the armies, and there were many of them, providing laundry and cooking and nursing and sometimes more direct support, lived at the margins of the military history in conditions of hardship that the formal record rarely captured adequately. For the indigenous nations of North America, the Revolutionary War was a catastrophe that unfolded with a clarity they could not always see at the time. Most indigenous nations that became involved in the conflict sided with the British, for reasons that were entirely logical from their own perspective. They had long experience of the relentless pressure of colonial expansion, and they understood that a British victory was far more likely to restrain that expansion than an American one. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois nations, split on the question, with most nations supporting the British while the Oneida and Tuscarora sided with the Americans, and the result was a civil war within the Confederacy that destroyed communities and relationships that had been fundamental to indigenous life in the Northeast for generations. The Sullivan-Clinton Expedition of 1779, in which Continental forces swept through Iroquois country burning villages and destroying food supplies in retaliation for frontier raids that had themselves been retaliations for earlier American aggressions, was one of the most thorough campaigns of destruction of the entire war. Whether independence or British sovereignty prevailed, the indigenous nations of the interior were going to face the continued expansion of American settlement, but the revolution accelerated and intensified that pressure in ways that made the subsequent history of those nations more directly catastrophic. In the cities that changed hands during the war, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Savannah, Charleston, the experience of occupation added another layer to the war's complexity. New York, under British occupation from September 1776 until the end of the war, became a refuge for Loyalists from throughout the North, a city swollen with displaced people living in conditions of overcrowding and uncertainty, sustained by the British military economy and dependent on an outcome that became progressively less certain as the years passed. Philadelphia under British occupation in the winter of 1777 to 1778 saw its Patriot population dispersed and its Loyalist population briefly ascendant, hosting a social season that included the elaborate entertainment known as the Mischianza, organized by British officers in honor of the departing General Howe, an event that struck many observers at the time as an act of unseemly frivolity in the middle of a desperate war. The finances of the Revolution were a persistent and ultimately near-fatal problem. The Continental Congress had no power to levy taxes. It could only request contributions from the states, contributions that were irregularly and inadequately made. It could borrow money, and it did, from France and the Netherlands and from domestic lenders, accumulating debts that would haunt the new nation for decades. And it could print money, paper currency known as continentals, the value of which declined with such consistent speed that the phrase "not worth a continental" became a common expression of worthlessness. The inflation that this currency produced was a tax on everyone who used it, falling most heavily on those with the least economic cushion. Robert Morris, who served as superintendent of finance beginning in 1781, performed something close to a miracle in sustaining the material underpinnings of the war effort through a combination of his own credit, his commercial connections, and considerable ingenuity in managing resources that were never adequate to the task. But the financial situation remained fragile throughout, and the question of whether the states and the Congress could sustain the war effort long enough for the military situation to produce a decisive result was one that had no confident answer. Washington, through all of this, the victories and the defeats, the frozen winters and the desperate supply shortages, the political pressures from Congress and the social tensions within his own army, the constant anxiety about enlistments and the perpetual uncertainty about the future, maintained through it all a quality that those around him found difficult to describe precisely but consistently remarked upon. It was a steadiness, a refusal to lose his composure in the face of circumstances that would have broken most men, a capacity to absorb disaster without surrendering and to transform small successes into the psychological momentum that kept his army together and his cause alive. He was not without failures or mistakes. His battlefield tactics were sometimes questionable, and he lost a great many of the engagements he fought. His relationships with some of his officers were strained, and there were periods, most clearly in the so-called Conway Cabal of 1777 to 1778, in which some members of Congress and some military officers attempted to question his leadership and suggest replacing him with Horatio Gates in the aftermath of the Philadelphia campaign, when his position was less secure than it appeared. But he survived these challenges, partly through the loyalty of the officers around him, and partly through his own careful management of the political relationships that determined his standing. By 1777, the war had taken on the shape that it would hold, with variations through the years still to come. It was a war in which neither side could deliver a knockout blow, in which the British had the military resources to hold major cities and win most formal battles but could not suppress the rebellion throughout the country, and in which the Americans had the determination to keep an army in the field but not yet the strength to force a decisive conclusion. The entry of France had transformed the strategic situation by introducing the one element the Americans could not provide for themselves: a naval power capable of challenging British dominance of the seas. Whether that transformation would be enough, whether the alliance and the endurance and the gradually improving military professionalism of the Continental Army would prove sufficient to outlast the British commitment to suppression, was a question that the end of 1777 left genuinely open. The victory at Saratoga had demonstrated that the Americans could win. The disasters of the summer and autumn had demonstrated that they could also lose badly. The French alliance had raised the possibility of ultimate success to something more than a desperate hope. But the war was far from over, and the distance still to be traveled was measured not only in military campaigns but in the suffering and sacrifice of ordinary people on both sides whose stake in the outcome was immediate and personal, and would be paid in the most direct terms imaginable. The winter of 1777 to 1778, as Washington's men endured Valley Forge, was also the winter in which something was being decided that the soldiers themselves could not have fully articulated, but that their continued presence there, hungry and cold and sick, but still there, expressed more powerfully than any document or declaration. They had not left. They had not gone home. Against every calculation of immediate self-interest, they had stayed, and in staying they had kept alive the possibility of something that was still far from certain but that was no longer entirely beyond imagining. The war had become what it needed to become, though at enormous cost. A sustained conflict, not a single outburst of anger and energy, but a long and patient contest of wills between an empire that could not afford to fail and a nation that was still in the process of deciding what it was. The outcome was not determined. The hardest fighting lay ahead. The peace was still years away, and the road to it would pass through more suffering and more sacrifice than anyone in that valley winter could have fully anticipated. But the possibility existed. It had been paid for in the currency that history accepts, in blood and cold and hunger and the stubborn refusal of men to surrender what they had decided to believe in, And it was real in the way that things paid for at great cost always feel real, with a weight and a substance that cheaper things do not possess. The army would move when spring came. The war would continue. And somewhere in the gathering distance, past the campaigns still to be fought and the decisions still to be made and the losses still to be endured, there was an outcome that was beginning, just barely, to seem possible. Not certain, not close, not guaranteed by anything except the determination of the people still committed to it, but possible in a way it had not been before. That was for the moment enough to keep going. And keeping going as the winter finally began to loosen its hold on the Pennsylvania hills, was exactly what they did. Spring comes slowly to Pennsylvania hill country. The ground releases its frost in stages reluctantly, and the trees take their time about leafing out, as if they are not entirely convinced that the cold is finished. In the spring of 1778, the men who had survived Valley Forge emerged into that cautious season changed in ways they could not always name. Thinner certainly, marked by the winter in ways that would stay with some of them for the rest of their lives. But something else had happened alongside the suffering, something that is not visible in the casualty lists or the supply records that historians consult to reconstruct those months. A settling, a hardening of commitment, a clarification of purpose that comes sometimes to people who have endured something together that they did not expect to survive. The army that left Valley Forge was not a large army. It was not a lavishly equipped army. It was not, by the standards of the professional European forces it would have to contend with, an army of impressive regularity or martial polish. But it was more cohesive than it had been, more disciplined, more capable of executing the kinds of maneuvers that translated tactical ideas into battlefield results. Friedrich von Steuben's months of drilling had done something real, not by turning American soldiers into Prussian automatons, which was neither possible nor, under the circumstances, desirable, but by giving the army a common language of movement and a shared understanding of how a military formation was supposed to behave under the pressures of combat. The news that arrived in the spring of that year did more for morale than any training regimen could have. The formal treaties with France, signed in February 1778 and ratified by the Continental Congress in May, represented a transformation of the war's fundamental character that even the most cautious among Washington's officers could not help but regard with something like relief. France was not a minor or marginal power offering sympathy and a trickle of supplies. France was one of the two greatest military powers in the world, and its commitment to the American cause meant, at minimum, that the British could no longer concentrate their entire military and naval capacity against the colonies without risking ruin in other theaters. The French Navy, large, recently rebuilt, and crewed by men who had spent the years since the 7 Years' War waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, was now an instrument available to the American cause, and naval power was the one dimension of military capacity that the Americans had been entirely unable to supply for themselves. There was, inevitably, a gap between what the French alliance promised and what it immediately delivered. Alliance treaties are documents, and the transformation of documents into ships and soldiers and money takes time even in the best of circumstances, and the circumstances of the late 18th century were not always the best. The first French naval intervention in American waters in the summer of 1778, under the Comte d'Estaing, produced disappointment more than triumph. The French fleet failed to coordinate effectively with American forces in attempts at Newport, Rhode Island, and Savannah, Georgia, and d'Estaing withdrew to the Caribbean before either operation could be brought to a successful conclusion. But the disappointments of the early alliance were not a refutation of its strategic importance. They were the friction of a new partnership between forces that had not yet learned how to work together, and that friction would diminish as the relationship matured. The British government, for its part, understood immediately and with some alarm what the French alliance meant. Lord North reportedly told the king upon receiving the news that he wished to resign, a wish that the king declined to honor. The strategic problem facing the British was suddenly much more complex. An Atlantic empire sustained by naval power could not afford to have that naval power seriously challenged, and France had been building toward exactly that challenge for 20 years. The West Indian Sugar Islands, which were more economically valuable to Britain than all of mainland North America, now needed to be defended. Gibraltar, which Spain would attack when it entered the war in 1779, was a commitment of its own. The Netherlands, which had been supplying the American cause through the Caribbean port of St. Eustatius, would be drawn into the war by 1780 following British seizure of Dutch ships. One after another, The conflicts that had been contained to North America spread outward across the Atlantic world until Britain found itself at war not merely with rebellious colonists but with a coalition of European powers that threatened its global position in ways that the American rebellion alone never could have. The strategic consequence of this spreading conflict was exactly what American diplomats had hoped for when they began their negotiations in Paris. British resources and attention were divided. The forces available for operations in North America had to compete with demands from the Caribbean, from Gibraltar, from India, from the Channel, from every point on the globe where British interests touched French or Spanish ones. General Clinton in New York found himself repeatedly stripped of the troops he needed for decisive operations in America because those troops were needed somewhere else. The war in North America became, from the British perspective, one problem among many rather than the central problem it had been in 1776. This did not make the remaining years easy. The war continued with a grinding persistence that wore at both sides, and the periods of near desperation for the American cause did not end with Valley Forge. The summer and autumn of 1780 brought some of the worst news of the entire conflict. The fall of Charleston in May 1780 with the loss of 5,000 Continental troops was followed by the destruction of another American army under Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, whose reputation would not survive the South. At the Battle of Camden in August, when British forces under Cornwallis routed the American force so completely that Gates himself fled the field on horseback and did not stop for some distance, the Continental cause of the South appeared to have been comprehensively extinguished, and the British Southern strategy seemed, for the moment, to be worked out. The summer of 1780 also held the most significant revelation of internal betrayal that the Revolution produced. Arnold, the general whose fighting qualities had been so crucial at Saratoga, and who had been nursing grievances against the Continental Congress for years over promotions and recognition that he felt he deserved and had been denied, had been engaged in secret negotiations with the British for the better part of a year. His specific plan was to surrender West Point, a fortification on the Hudson River that was the strategic key to the entire Northern Theater, to the British in exchange for a commission in the British Army and a substantial sum of money. The plan was discovered in September 1780 when the British officer carrying Arnold's papers, Major John Andre, was captured behind American lines and the documents found on him revealed the conspiracy. Arnold escaped to the British before he could be arrested. Andre was tried and hanged as a spy. The revelation of Arnold's treason struck the Patriot cause with a force that went beyond the immediate military danger averted. Arnold had been one of the most celebrated military figures in the Continental Army, a man of genuine physical courage and tactical brilliance, whose service had been genuinely valuable to the cause. If he could be turned, if a man of his record and his abilities could be seduced by money and wounded pride into selling out everything he had fought for, then what did that say about the solidity of anyone's commitment? The shock was compounded by the particular object of the treachery. West Point commanded the Hudson, and the Hudson commanded the connection between New England and the Middle and Southern states. The British had been trying to cut that connection since the beginning of the war. Arnold had come within a discovered letter of giving it to them. Washington's response to the Arnold affair, as to so much else that threatened to break his composure, was outwardly controlled in a way that contemporaries found almost uncanny. Privately, in his correspondence, the anguish was visible. He had trusted Arnold. Many in the officer corps had trusted him. The betrayal was personal as well as political, and the personal dimension of it, the question of who else might be harboring undisclosed grievances, of how many of the men around him were truly committed to the cause they claimed, was one that could not be entirely dismissed. But the war did not stop for reflection. And in the South, where the situation had seemed most dire, a recovery was beginning that would prove more consequential than anything happening in the North. The replacement of Horatio Gates with Nathaniel Greene as commander of the Southern Continental Forces in December 1780 was one of the most important command decisions of the entire war. Greene was not a battlefield hero like Arnold Moore. He was a Rhode Island soldier, methodical and clear-eyed, and possessed of strategic intelligence that expressed itself in patience and in the management of philosophy rather than in the kind of impetuous valor that made good results but sometimes poor outcomes. His approach to the Southern campaign was to avoid the pitched battles that the British wanted to fight and that Greene's inferior forces could not win, while keeping an army in the field that could not be destroyed and that could, through constant pressure and constant movement, exhaust and erode the British force rather than defeating it in a single decisive engagement. The guerrilla warfare that developed in the Carolinas during this period was brutal in its character and important in its effect. Partisan commanders Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens operated with small mobile forces that attacked British supply lines, disrupted Loyalist organization, and kept the southern countryside from settling into the accommodation with British authority that the Southern strategy required to succeed. Marion, in particular, operating from the swamps of the PD River region, achieved a kind of legendary status in his own time, and the image of him and his men disappearing into the wetlands after an engagement and reappearing unexpectedly somewhere else became one of the defining images of the Southern War. The legends attached to partisan leaders like Marion have been embellished considerably by later storytellers, and the actual historical record of their activities is often more complicated and more violent in both directions than the romantic versions suggest. But their strategic contribution was real. The Battle of Cowpens in January 1781 was one of the most tactically elegant engagements of the entire war. Daniel Morgan, commanding a mixed force of Continentals and militia, arranged his troops on open ground in a way that turned the usual weakness of militia, their tendency to fire a volley and then run, into a planned feature of the tactical design. The militia were placed in front, instructed to fire twice and then withdraw to the flanks, making the British think they were breaking and routing. When the British pursued in disorder, they ran into the Continental regulars behind the militia line, and then the returned militia hit their flanks. The result was the near-total destruction of the British force under Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton, with a very high proportion captured. Cowpens was not a large battle, but it demonstrated what an American force, well led and making intelligent use of the terrain and the character of its men, could accomplish against professional opponents. Cornwallis, enraged by the destruction of his light infantry at Cowpens, pursued Greene's force northward through the Carolinas in what became a campaign of exhausting marches. Greene kept just ahead of the British, drawing Cornwallis further from his coastal supply bases and deeper into a countryside that was increasingly hostile. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March 1781 was, by the measures that counted on the day, a British tactical victory. The Americans left the field, but the cost in British casualties was severe enough that Charles James Fox remarked in Parliament that another such victory would ruin the British Army in the South. Cornwallis had effectively won the battle and lost the campaign. He withdrew to the North Carolina coast and eventually moved his army north into Virginia, where he hoped to find a more favorable strategic position, and where his army's presence would open a new and destructive front in one of the wealthiest and most important of the rebellious states. Virginia in 1781 was a theater that the war had not yet directly touched with the same intensity it had brought to the Carolinas, and Cornwallis's march through the state was accompanied by destruction of property and a general disruption that the Virginia gentry found deeply alarming. The governor of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, was nearly captured when British cavalry under Tarleton raided Charlottesville in June of 1781. Jefferson escaped with only minutes to spare, and the incident would be used against him by political opponents for the rest of his life. The episode illustrated both the vulnerability of the state and the difficulty of governing effectively when the war had come to one's own doorstep. Washington, watching events in Virginia from his position in the North, where he had been facing Clinton's army in New York for the better part of 3 years, was thinking about the possibility of a decisive blow in a way that the grinding stalemate of the Northern theater had not previously allowed. The French alliance had by now matured to a point where genuine coordination was possible. The Comte de Rochambeau had arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, in the summer of 1780 with a French expeditionary army of some 5,000 men, and he had been working with Washington through the subsequent months in a relationship that was diplomatically delicate. Rochambeau was technically subordinate to Washington but was commanding French troops under French command, and the cultural and institutional differences between the two armies required careful management. The relationship between the two commanders appears, from the historical record, to have been marked by mutual respect and, on Rochambeau's part, by a patience with the constraints of the partnership that was generous and ultimately crucial to its success. The plan that emerged in the summer of 1781 was one of those strategic conceptions that appears obvious in retrospect but required considerable imagination and risk tolerance to arrive at in the moment. Rather than attacking New York, which Washington had long wanted to do and Rochambeau had consistently argued was too strong, the combined Franco-American force would march south to Virginia, coordinate with French naval forces that were moving from the Caribbean under the Comte de Grasse, and attempt to trap Cornwallis on the Virginia Peninsula between the James and York Rivers. The plan depended on the coordination of forces separated by hundreds of miles, on the ability to deceive Clinton in New York long enough for the march south to be completed, and above all on the French fleet arriving in the Chesapeake at the right moment and in sufficient strength to prevent the British from rescuing Cornwallis by sea. The deception of Clinton was managed with considerable skill. Washington and Rochambeau maintained the pretense of preparing to attack New York even as their forces began moving south, and Clinton, habitually cautious and uncertain about American intentions, did not respond effectively until the opportunity to interrupt the march had passed. The combined army moved through New Jersey, crossed the Delaware, passed through Philadelphia, where the troops were reviewed by the Congress, and Washington arranged for the men to be paid, at least partially, in coin rather than the depreciated paper that had been their usual compensation, and continued south toward Chesapeake Bay. The critical moment came not on land but at sea. The Battle of the Chesapeake, fought on September 5, 1781, between the French fleet under de Grasse and the British fleet under Graves, was the naval engagement that determined the outcome of the entire war, though it is far less famous than it deserves to be. The battle itself was not a clear-cut tactical victory for either side. It was a confused engagement in which the two fleets exchanged fire without decisive result, and then separated. But the strategic outcome was unambiguous. The British fleet, having suffered significant damage and finding itself unable to force its way into the Chesapeake, withdrew to New York for repairs. The French were left in control of the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis was cut off from relief or evacuation by sea. The trap had closed. The siege of Yorktown began in earnest in early October of 1781. The combined French and American army, numbering perhaps 17,000 in total, besieged Cornwallis's force of around 8,000 on the peninsula of Yorktown in a methodical siege operation conducted according to the formal European conventions of siege warfare that Rochambeau's engineers understood well, and that Washington and his officers were learning in real time. The parallel trenches were dug closer and closer to the British fortifications. Artillery was positioned and fired with a weight of metal that the British garrison could not match. The British redoubts that anchored the southern end of the defensive line were stormed in coordinated night attacks on October 14, the American column taking Redoubt 10, the French column taking Redoubt 9, in operations that were carried out with bayonets rather than firearms in silence, with a speed that reduced the exposure of the attacking forces and reflected the kind of precise coordination between the two allies that the summer and autumn's experience had finally made possible. Cornwallis attempted to evacuate his army across the York River to the north shore on the night of October 16, but a storm scattered the boats and the attempt was abandoned. By the morning of October 17, it was clear to everyone on both sides that the situation was without remedy. A British officer appeared on the Yorktown fortifications with the white flag. Negotiations for the surrender began. The terms were agreed on October 18, and the formal ceremony of surrender took place on October 19, 1781. The ceremony itself was layered with the small human ironies that attach themselves to great historical events. Cornwallis did not appear in person, citing illness, an illness that contemporaries and some historians have suggested owed as much to wounded pride as to physical indisposition. His second-in-command, General O'Hara, brought out the sword of surrender and apparently attempted to present it to Rochambeau rather than to Washington, perhaps reflecting a reluctance to surrender to an American specifically. Rochambeau declined and directed O'Hara to Washington, who in turn directed him to his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, who had been forced to surrender Charleston to the British 18 months before, and who now received the British capitulation in a gesture that carried a satisfaction too particular to be entirely coincidental. The British troops, according to some accounts, marched out with their colors furled and their band playing a tune called The World Turned Upside Down, though whether this detail is entirely accurate or has been embellished by later telling is something that historians have not been able to confirm with complete certainty. The image it contains, of a world whose expected order has been inverted by something no one fully anticipated, feels true to the moment even if the specific fact remains uncertain. The news of Yorktown reached London in late November of 1781, and its reception there ended, for most practical purposes, the political will to continue the war. Lord North, upon hearing the report, is said to have reacted as if he had taken a musket ball to the chest, pacing and repeating that it was all over. Whether the precise words attributed to him in various accounts are accurate is uncertain, but the substance of his reaction was consistent with what followed. North's government fell in March of 1782. The new ministry that came in under Rockingham and then under Shelburne was prepared to negotiate a peace that acknowledged American independence, something no British government had been willing to contemplate before the catastrophe of Yorktown made the alternative, the continuation of an increasingly expensive and unpopular war against a coalition of European powers, plainly worse. The peace negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris were themselves a complicated and sometimes contentious diplomatic process. The American commissioners, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, were instructed by the Continental Congress to defer to French guidance in the negotiations, an instruction that Franklin in particular found increasingly problematic as the negotiations proceeded. The French government had its own interests, which did not perfectly align with American interests on every point. Spain, as France's ally, had its own territorial ambitions in North America that complicated the picture further. And the British negotiators, aware of these tensions within the American alliance, attempted to use them to secure better terms. The American commissioners ultimately took the decision to negotiate directly with Britain without fully consulting the French, concluding a preliminary peace agreement in November 1782 that secured terms considerably more favorable to the United States than might otherwise have been obtained. The boundary established by the treaty placed the new nation's western limit at the Mississippi River, a boundary far more generous than many had expected, and that gave the United States enormous potential for westward expansion. The right of American fishermen to fish in the waters off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia was secured. The British agreed to withdraw their forces from American territory. The Americans, for their part, agreed that Congress would recommend to the states that they restore the property of Loyalists, a provision whose practical effect was limited, since Congress could recommend but not compel, and most states had no intention of restoring Loyalist property in any case. The final Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, nearly 8 years after the first shots at Lexington and Concord, and more than 2 years after the British surrender at Yorktown. The delay between Yorktown and the final treaty reflected the complexity of a peace settlement that involved not just Britain and the United States but France, Spain, and the Netherlands, each of which needed to reach its own accommodation with Britain before the broader settlement could be concluded. The world that the treaty described, its boundaries, its commercial arrangements, its allocation of territories among the competing imperial powers, was a world remade by a conflict that had grown far beyond anything its participants had imagined at the beginning. For the indigenous nations of North America, the treaty was a betrayal that they could not have failed to recognize. Britain transferred sovereignty over territories that had never been fully under British control, in which indigenous nations had been living and governing themselves according to their own laws and customs for centuries. The Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the many other nations whose lands were included within the generous western boundary the treaty assigned to the United States had not been party to the negotiations. Their interests had not been represented. They were simply included, as if they were empty land rather than human communities with their own claims and their own histories. The consequences of that exclusion would unfold across the subsequent century with a completeness and a devastation that was already imaginable to anyone willing to look at what the American settler population had done wherever it had reached in the preceding 150 years. For the Loyalists, those tens of thousands of people who had made the choice to support the Crown and who had paid for that choice with displacement, property loss, and in many cases the permanent destruction of the lives they had built, the treaty was similarly inadequate. The provision recommending the restoration of Loyalist property was, as everyone involved understood, essentially empty. The states had confiscated Loyalist estates throughout the war, selling them off to pay for the war effort and distributing them in ways that created new webs of interest in their continued possession. The people who had bought or received those properties were not going to give them back on a congressional recommendation, and the states were not going to force them to. Many Loyalists, those who had gathered in British-held cities, and who had not yet made their final decisions about exile, began the painful work of leaving a country that had been theirs. They went to Nova Scotia, to New Brunswick, to Upper Canada, to England, to the Bahamas, to wherever the British government could arrange something that resembled a landing. Some received compensation from the British government for their losses, through a commission that processed claims for years after the war. The compensation was rarely adequate, and it could not restore what had actually been lost, which was not only property but place, the belonging to a community and a land that money cannot buy and that exile makes into a wound that does not heal cleanly. The British soldiers who had fought the war, the regulars and the Hessians who had crossed the Atlantic to suppress a rebellion that proved unsuppressible, returned home to a country that was not entirely sure what to do with them or with the defeat they represented. Britain had not lost a major war in living memory, and the experience of Yorktown and its aftermath was something that the national self-image had to work to accommodate. The tendency, which developed fairly quickly in British public discourse, was to explain the loss in terms of particular failures, the divided command, the underestimation of French naval power, the inadequacies of this minister or that general, rather than to confront the possibility that the colonial cause had contained within it a moral and political force that military power alone was never going to be sufficient to overcome. This kind of explanatory deflection is common in the aftermath of unexpected defeats, and it served its purpose of protecting the national self-understanding, at the cost of obscuring some of the deeper lessons the war had to teach. In America, the mood of the immediate post-war period was not simply jubilant. It was, as the mood of endings usually is, more complicated than that. There was relief, certainly, and pride, and the particular satisfaction of having accomplished something that the world at large had not expected to be accomplished. But there was also exhaustion. There was grief for the dead, and the dead were numerous. The estimates of total American military deaths across the 8 years of the war run to perhaps 25,000, though counting is made difficult by the fragmentary nature of the records and the different ways of counting, and the figure would be considerably higher if the deaths from disease, which killed more soldiers than combat in this as in most wars of the era, are fully included. There was economic disruption, the consequences of years of inflation and debt, and the destruction of property and the interruption of trade that peace did not immediately repair. And there was the question, the enormous, unanswered, and in some ways unanswerable question, of what the revolution had actually created. The Declaration of Independence had announced a nation, but the 13 states that emerged from the war were bound together by the Articles of Confederation, a governing document that had been devised during the war to coordinate the common effort and that, in the light of peace, revealed itself to be quite poorly suited to the long-term requirements of unified national governance. The Congress under the Articles had no power to tax. It could not compel the states to contribute to the common treasury. It could not regulate commerce between the states. It could not enforce its own decisions against states that chose to ignore them. It was, as its critics increasingly recognized, less a national government than a diplomatic conference of sovereign states that happened to share a common language and a common experience of revolution. The years between the end of the war in 1783 and the drafting of a new constitution in 1787 were years of genuine uncertainty about whether the new nation would hold together. The states quarreled with each other over tariffs and boundaries and commercial regulations. Veterans who had fought the war went unpaid, their promised pensions and land grants uncertain and delayed. In Massachusetts, the state that had done so much to start the Revolution, an uprising of farmers and debtors led by Daniel Shays in 1786 and 1787, men who had served in the Continental Army, and who found themselves unable to pay their debts in a state that demanded hard currency for taxes, shook the established order and frightened the men of property throughout the country into a sharper recognition that the constitutional inadequacies of the existing system were not merely theoretical problems but active dangers. Washington, who had resigned his commission to Congress in a ceremony at Annapolis in December of 1783, a ceremony that was itself enormously significant, a military commander voluntarily returning power to civilian authority in a gesture that had almost no precedent in the history of Republican government and that contemporaries recognized as such, was watching the deterioration of the national situation from his retirement at Mount Vernon with increasing alarm. He wrote to his correspondents that the Union was in danger, that the states were pulling apart rather than together, that the experiment in Republican government was at risk of failing before it had properly begun. Whether his alarm was entirely proportionate to the actual danger or was colored by the particular anxieties of a man who had given so much to the cause and could not bear to see it squandered is a question worth holding, but the deterioration of the national situation was real enough that many people shared his concern. The Constitutional Convention that assembled in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was, in some respects, the Second American Revolution, a less dramatic one, fought in committee rooms rather than on battlefields, but consequential in its own way. The delegates who arrived had been authorized by the Congress under the Articles to revise those articles, but they quickly concluded that revision would not suffice and produced instead an entirely new governing document. The debates over the Constitution were genuine and sometimes fierce, and the document that emerged was a product of compromise, on representation, on the relationship between large and small states, on the question of slavery, on the extent of federal power, that satisfied no one entirely, and that a significant portion of the country's political leadership opposed on the grounds that it concentrated too much power in the central government. The ratification of the Constitution, which required the approval of 9 of the 13 states, was achieved only after extended debate, and in several crucial states, after the promise of amendments that would explicitly protect individual liberties against the power of the new federal government. Those amendments, the first 10, which became the Bill of Rights, were drafted and ratified in the first years of the new government, providing the legal protections for speech and religion and assembly and due process that the Constitution's critics had insisted were necessary and that subsequent generations would come to regard as foundational. Washington was the unanimous choice of the Electoral College to be the first president of the United States, the only person in the history of the office to receive that distinction, and he took the oath in New York, the first capital of the new republic, in April of 1789. The government that began its operation in those first months was inventing itself as it went, establishing precedents in decisions large and small that would shape the institution for centuries because there was no established practice to refer to, no accumulated custom to fall back on. How should the president be addressed? What was the appropriate ceremonial for official occasions? How should the relationship between the executive and legislative branches be managed in practice? These were questions for which the Constitution provided general answers but not specific ones, and the answers given in those early years became, through repetition and imitation, the norms of American governance. The challenges the new government faced were formidable. The national debt inherited from the war was substantial. Relations with Britain remained difficult. The British had not fully withdrawn from the frontier posts they were supposed to have evacuated under the Treaty of Paris, and commercial relations were complicated by disagreements that the treaty had not fully resolved. Relations with France, the ally that had made independence possible, would become difficult in the 1790s as the French Revolution turned radical and then violent and as American politics divided over whether gratitude to France required taking France's side in its wars with Britain. Spain controlled the Mississippi River and disputed the boundary of American territory in the South and West, threatening the Western settlements that were already beginning to push beyond the Appalachians. The political divisions that would define the first generation of American governance were already visible in the debates over the Constitution and the first years of the new government. The argument between those who believed in a strong central government capable of binding the nation together and managing its affairs with something approaching national coherence, associated most clearly with Alexander Hamilton, Washington's former aide and the first Secretary of the Treasury, and those who believed that the states should retain the primary locus of power, and that the federal government should be limited in its reach, associated most clearly with Jefferson and Madison, was not merely a technical dispute about governmental structure. It reflected genuinely different visions of what the Revolution had meant and what the Republic was supposed to be. It was, in a very real sense, the argument that the Revolution had started but not finished because revolutions rarely finish the arguments they begin. The enslaved people who had been present throughout the entire revolutionary period, who had watched it, suffered through it, sometimes participated in it, and whose labor had made possible much of the wealth and leisure that allowed their enslavers to think and write and debate about liberty, were no closer to freedom in 1789 than they had been in 1776. The Constitution, in its compromises, had accommodated slavery in ways that its defenders chose not to name directly: the 3/5 Clause, the protection of the slave trade for 20 years, the fugitive slave provision, and the new government showed no signs of moving toward the confrontation with the institution that a literal reading of its founding principles would have seemed to require. The Revolution had been, for enslaved people, a great deal of noise and danger and disruption that ended, for most of them, exactly where it had begun. This is the deepest contradiction that the American founding bequeathed to its successors, and it cannot be resolved by rhetoric about the aspirational quality of the founding documents or by noting that Jefferson and Madison felt uneasy about it. The people who were enslaved were not symbols of an unfinished ideal. They were human beings whose suffering was real, and whose exclusion from the promises of the Revolution was deliberate and calculated and protected by law. The revolution and the republic it produced were, for them, not a beginning of anything but a continuation and in some respects a consolidation of a system of oppression that would not be legally ended until 89 years after the Declaration of Independence, at the cost of another war that made the revolution seem small by comparison. Women, too, found that the republic born of a revolution fought partly in the name of natural rights, had not reconsidered in any fundamental way the legal and political status that tradition assigned to them. The idea of Republican motherhood, the notion that women's contribution to the Republic was to raise virtuous Republican citizens, was genuinely an expansion of the cultural significance attached to the female sphere, and it reflected a recognition that the reproduction of Republican values across generations required deliberate effort in the home and the education of children. But it was not political equality. Women could not vote. They had limited legal standing. Their property, upon marriage, became their husbands'. The revolution had changed the language of rights in American public life, without extending the substance of those rights to the half of the population that was female. These are not easy things to hold alongside the genuine achievements of the revolutionary generation, and the tendency in retrospect is to resolve the tension by emphasizing one side or the other, either celebrating the founding as a triumph of human liberty or condemning it as a fraud perpetrated by men of property on those without. Neither resolution is adequate. The revolution was both things: a genuine and consequential step in the long human argument about self-governance and the limits of arbitrary power, and a profoundly compromised one, carried through by people who were simultaneously capable of articulating universal principles and of refusing to apply them to people they considered inconveniently placed outside the circle of those principles' application. What is perhaps most striking when one steps back far enough to see the whole shape of it, is how contingent it all was. How easily it might have gone differently. The revolutionary cause came close to defeat not once but many times. In the disasters around New York in 1776, in the near dissolution of the army at Valley Forge, in the catastrophes of 1780 in the South. The French alliance, without which independence was in all probability unachievable, depended on the willingness of a French monarchy to bankroll a republican revolution, a decision that would contribute, within a decade, to the bankruptcy and internal crisis that produced the French Revolution, with consequences that no one in Versailles in 1778 had the slightest intention of bringing about. The trap at Yorktown depended on de Grasse's fleet arriving at the right time and in sufficient force, on the British Admiral Graves failing to break through, on weather and timing and the thousand small factors that determine whether a complex military operation succeeds or collapses. The outcome was not written in advance. History rarely is, though the story of it, told afterward, tends to acquire a quality of inevitability that the experience of living through it never has. The people who fought and argued and endured and fled and died and governed and simply survived through those years did not know how it would end. They made their choices in conditions of genuine uncertainty, with incomplete information, moved by a mixture of principle and interest and fear and ambition and loyalty and hatred and love that is the actual substance of human motivation in any age. George Washington, who had been at the center of it for so long, retired from the presidency after 2 terms, a retirement that was itself another deliberate act of Republican self-abnegation, refusing the extension of power that many expected and some urged, and returned to Mount Vernon, where he died in December of 1799 at the age of 67, of what the physicians of the time called quinsy, but what modern medical opinion has generally identified as a severe throat infection treated with the aggressive bloodletting that the medical practice of the era prescribed, and that almost certainly accelerated rather than prevented his death. He died as the 18th century was ending and the 19th beginning, at the threshold of a future that he had done more than almost anyone else to make possible, and that he could not have imagined with any clarity. The republic he left behind was not yet 25 years old. It was a small thing in many respects, when measured against the empires that surrounded it and against the problems it had not yet addressed. Its population was perhaps 5 million, spread along the eastern seaboard and beginning to push westward into territories that were rich in land and resources and in the prior claims of people who would not easily yield them. Its government was functional but fragile, its finances uncertain, its political culture already showing the signs of the partisan divisions that would deepen through the 19th century. Its founding principles were beautiful and unimplemented, aspirations stated as accomplishments, ideals advanced as descriptions of a reality that did not yet exist. But there it was. A republic when it might so easily not have been. A nation, assembled from 13 quarrelsome colonies that had no obvious reason to stay together once the emergency that had pushed them together was past. A government that had transferred power peacefully from one leader to another, and then to another at a time when the world had very few examples of that happening and many examples of its opposite. A set of ideas about liberty, about consent, about the accountability of those who govern to those who are governed, that had been stated publicly and formally and given institutional form, however imperfectly, in a way that made them available to be argued over and demanded and extended and fought for by people in America and elsewhere for as long as the documents endured. The revolution that produced all of this was over. The meaning of it was not. The meaning of it was just beginning its long argument with itself, which is still continuing and which, by the nature of the questions it poses, is unlikely ever to be finally settled. That is perhaps the most accurate thing that can be said about it. Not that it succeeded or failed, not that it was right or wrong, not that its heroes were good men or its villains were bad ones, but that it opened something, a conversation, a contest, a set of possibilities, that had not been opened before and that could not be closed again once it had been opened. The fields of Concord and Lexington have long since been absorbed into the ordinary landscape of New England, roads and houses and the unremarkable vegetation of places that have had 2.5 centuries to grow over whatever was disturbed in them. The earthworks at Yorktown are still visible in places, softened by time into gentle rises in the Virginia ground that you might not notice if you did not know to look for them. The documents are in archives and on monuments and in schoolbooks, their language worn smooth by repetition into something between a prayer and a formula, familiar enough that the words can be spoken without the weight of what it cost to produce them being fully felt. But somewhere underneath the familiarity, if you slow down enough to feel it, is still the original strangeness of it, the improbability that it happened at all, that it came out as it did, that the men and women who were there managed to hold it together through years of privation and doubt and betrayal and fear to produce something that outlasted all of them and that remains, for all its contradictions and all its unfinished business, one of the genuinely consequential things that human beings have managed to make out of the unpromising material of their own divided and fallible nature. The revolution is over. The country it made is still being argued about, still being revised, still being tested against the principles it claimed from the beginning to embody. That argument is part of the inheritance. It is perhaps the most important part. And somewhere in the distance, in the years and decades and centuries that stretch forward from that last treaty, from that last surrender, from that last resigned and exhausted drawing of breath in the knowledge that the fighting is done, the argument continues. Untidy, unresolved, alive, which may be in the end exactly as it should be.